Hello, my dear friends. They called it progress, but it tasted like poison. In the glittering streets of Victorian England, sweetness itself became a weapon. Candies laced with arsenic, bread filled with chalk, and tea coloured by metal dust. Behind every polished shop window was a quiet horror disguised as refinement, where even kindness could kill, and beauty came at the price of blood. Tonight, you will walk those crowded markets, hear the vendors shout, and discover how millions were slowly poisoned in the name of civilization. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to sit inside a modest Victorian tea room and watch the stream of middle-class patrons, one would see how a spoonful of white sugar defined not just sweetness, but status itself. The fine crystals shimmered like tiny jewels in the light of gas lamps, poured into teacups or sprinkled over cakes as if each grain could buy a little refinement. The obsession with whiteness turned sugar into a silent badge of progress. To serve brown sugar was to admit poverty, so every household desired the purest white possible. Refiners promised it through industrial miracles, but purity in that age was only an illusion. In truth, the process was rough and careless. Sugar passed through tubs lined with lime and bone char, stirred by men whose hands were blackened with soot. Dust, ash, and small stones clung to the crystals. Yet the brighter it looked, the safer people felt. It was almost comic that people equated paleness with safety, as though poison could not shine. The richer the colour of their tea, the whiter the sugar they demanded to offset it, and the more invisible the danger became. Factories rose near ports, filled with steam, heat, and noise. Molasses boiled in open vats, releasing a heavy smell that coated the streets. The workers inside were mostly poor women and children, their skin irritated by fumes, their lungs raw from breathing in powder. They scraped residue from wooden troughs, wiped sweat from their faces, and continued without pause. The supervisors cared only for quantity, not quality. What left the factory was packed in barrels, often still wet and streaked with grit. In shops, merchants broke it down into smaller cones and sold it as fine luxury. Housewives chipped pieces from the hard loaves, believing each sparkle was a sign of refinement. If one compares this to today, it would be like calling the dust from a construction site organic flour and feeling proud to bake with it. The idea seems absurd, but in Victorian homes, it was the rhythm of everyday life. At the breakfast table, sugar appeared in every form imaginable. It covered toast, thickened porridge, flavoured coffee, and coated fruit. Cookbooks called it the soul of hospitality. Guests judged the hostess by how generously she sweetened her tea. For families trying to rise above their station, sugar was proof they belonged to polite society. They ignored its rough taste, its occasional crunch of grit between the teeth. What mattered was the look of whiteness, the image of gentility. Refiners learned this quickly. They mixed bone ash, chalk, and sometimes powdered stone to lighten the shade and stretch the supply. The result sparkled beautifully. It did not dissolve properly, but few noticed. They were too pleased by its appearance to question what it truly was. As consumption grew, sickness followed quietly behind. Stomach pains, mouth ulcers, and strange rashes became common. Doctors called them digestive disorders or industrial fatigue, never suspecting sugar as the cause. Even when a shipment was found tainted with grey dust, it was sold anyway, simply labelled economy blend. Something is haunting about realising how people trusted what glittered, while the filth clung beneath the surface. I sometimes imagine a mother pouring sugar into her child's tea, unaware that each spoonful carried ground bone and lime from faraway plantations. She smiles, proud to offer what the wealthy enjoy, not knowing the sickness it will bring. The deeper cruelty lay in how this trade shaped society. Sugar was once a rare import from colonies, soaked in blood and labour. When it became cheap, it did not lose its cruelty. It merely hid it behind polished cups and delicate manners. To the Victorian mind, sweetness symbolised virtue. It softened the harshness of industrial life, masking the soot that clung to every breath. People were willing to overlook the grime as long as the tea sparkled and the cakes shone. Workers at refineries coughed through the night, their teeth eroded by chemicals, their wages barely enough to buy the very product they made. Yet advertisements called sugar the taste of civilization. The irony is bitter. The substance meant to sweeten life carried more corruption than any spice of its age. Public health officials rarely intervened. There were no laws requiring purity tests. A merchant could sell powdered chalk as sugar and face no punishment. Some even added alum to make the grains brighter, a substance known to cause stomach bleeding. Letters appeared in newspapers from readers complaining of strange aftertastes or gritty residue, but editors dismissed them as isolated cases. Commerce thrived on denial. The city glittered with shop windows filled with confections, puddings, and gleaming sugar loaves, each a small monument to industrial pride. The more people consumed, the more the illusion of progress grew. In homes of the poor, the story was different but no less tragic. They bought remnants from broken barrels, sugar mixed with dirt and crushed insects. They stirred it into weak tea to fight fatigue, believing sweetness could replace nourishment. For them, it was a small luxury in a life of scarcity. Even if it made them sick, they continued, because to give it up felt like surrendering to poverty. The craving for sweetness was not just about taste, it was about dignity. Doctors who tried to warn the public were ignored. Their voices were lost among advertisements promising health and happiness. Government officials spoke of trade, not safety. They measured success in exports, not in lives. It took years before anyone understood that the refined white powder on their tables was not refined at all. By then, countless stomachs had been burned by lime. Countless children had grown weak from contaminated sweets, and yet society moved on. The belief that beauty and cleanliness went hand in hand blinded an entire generation. Sugar became the quiet killer that no one questioned. It was present in every celebration, in every comfort, in every act of affection. Mothers sweetened milk, bakers glazed buns, and lovers exchanged candied fruits. All the while, impurities built inside their bodies, slow and unseen. When illness came, it felt random, inevitable, part of a life's hardship. Few traced it back to the sweetness that filled their cups each morning. The empire's appetite for refinement demanded that everything, even food, look flawless. And so the poison was polished, the filth was bleached, and the death was sugared over. That was the real cost of purity in the age of progress. The story of white sugar is not just about sweetness, but about blindness, a society polishing death until it gleamed. As the craving for purity deepened, new inventions promised even cheaper miracles of taste. Among them appeared the shimmering tins of preserved meat, carrying a different kind of decay hidden beneath their shine. The tins arrived stacked high on wooden crates, their metallic sheen promising nourishment that most working families could not afford fresh. The label showed images of cows grazing in green pastures, a vision entirely foreign to the grey streets of industrial cities. For labourers earning just enough to survive, these tins were miracles of convenience. They could be stored for months, opened quickly, and required no cooking skills. Housewives bought them by the dozen, believing they had found a way to feed their families cheaply and decently. The advertisements called it progress, the taste of the new modern world. Yet progress had its own odour, and in this case, It was the scent of rot sealed under tin. When the cans were opened, the contents rarely looked like meat. The texture was soft, greasy, and oddly grey. Sometimes it released a hiss as trapped air escaped, carrying with it a sour stench that spread through the room. Still, it was eaten. People had grown used to the smells of decay around them. Streets were lined with dung, smoke, and refuse, so one more foul odour hardly mattered. The saltiness burned the tongue, but hunger softened judgment. It is grimly funny that something so foul could still be called dinner simply because it came in a shiny can. The metal shell created the illusion of safety, as if industry itself could protect the poor from hunger. In reality, it only hid the filth from sight. The process behind these tins was far from the clean factories pictured on the labels. In slaughterhouses across the ocean, carcasses too old or diseased to sell fresh were ground into paste to stop them from turning black. Workers mixed in bleaching agents and strong brine. The mixture was boiled, skimmed, and poured into tins lined with cheap solder that leaked lead into the meat. Once sealed, it was shipped across the Atlantic by the ton. By the time it reached England, it had changed colour again, and the smell had deepened. But merchants sold it proudly, praising its long shelf life. Inspectors did exist, but most were easily bribed. Reports of worms, mould, and rancid fats surfaced occasionally, only to disappear after a payment. Workers who packed the meat often spoke of rats falling into the vats, or of meat swept from factory floors to fill missing portions. Their words carried no weight. No one cared about the voices of the poor, especially when they accused industry of deceit. The public trusted the gleam of the tin more than any rumour of contamination. To question it was to risk being called ignorant or hysterical. For the families who lived on this food, choice did not exist. Fresh meat spoiled quickly, and even small cuts were expensive. A tin of beef, no matter how suspicious, was still protein. Mothers fed it to their children in thin slices, mixed with potatoes or bread crust to stretch the meal. Fathers carried sandwiches of tinned meat to factories, eating them cold during short breaks. The taste was metallic, the smell sour, but the stomach was quieted. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like eating leftovers scooped from a garbage bin, packaged beautifully and sold as health food. The difference lies only in presentation, not in truth. When sickness came, no one suspected the tins. The symptoms were varied and cruel. People complained of dizziness, burning throats, and aching limbs. Some collapsed at work, their skin turning grey from lead poisoning. Others died silently in their beds. Doctors blamed fatigue, bad air, or even the will of God. The manufacturers continued unhindered, their profits rising with each shipment. The dead left no mark on the balance sheets. At markets, vendors sold opened tins by weight, scooping the mush onto papers and wrapping it like butter. Flies gathered instantly, but customers ignored them. The desire for meat, any meat, was stronger than disgust. Children learned early that a tin on the shelf meant security, even if it stank when opened. Hunger did not care about smell. Hunger made everything acceptable. It is disturbing to imagine that survival could depend on swallowing decay. Yet that was the reality of Victorian poverty. Officials sometimes ordered public demonstrations to assure the people that canned goods were safe. They would open tins before crowds, stir the contents, and taste a spoonful while smiling. These performances calmed fears for a while. Meanwhile, merchants continued importing from suppliers known for using industrial chemicals as preservatives. The cycle of deceit repeated endlessly, sealed by habit and desperation. Factories grew rich while bodies grew weaker. The cheap meat filled their bellies but slowly poisoned them. Its salt content caused thirst and exhaustion. Its chemicals attacked the stomach. Families accepted it as part of life, never realizing that the very food that kept them alive was killing them slowly. The bright tins stood proudly on shelves beside flour and sugar, symbols of progress that masked a rotting core. I can almost picture one of those kitchens, a mother spooning grey meat onto her children's plates while trying not to breathe too deeply. She smiles faintly, relieved to serve a full meal for once. The candlelight glints off the can, making it look almost noble, almost trustworthy. That is the cruel power of appearance, to make poison seem generous. The story of the tinned meat reveals how progress can disguise decay and turn hunger into a marketplace. As the poor learn to trust metal over smell, a new kind of false comfort began spreading through bakeries and shops. Its golden surface gleamed like sunlight, but beneath it hid chemicals that would burn from the inside out. In the crowded alleys of industrial towns, the scent of frying bread and cheap stew filled the air, masking something more artificial that spread quietly from shop to shop. It was the new marvel of modern living, a substance that promised the taste of butter without the price. Housewives called it progress, merchants called it invention, and chemists called it economy. The truth was simpler and uglier. What spread over those slices of bread was not butter at all, but a mixture of animal fat, wax, and dye. It shone in the lamplight, yellow and smooth, pretending to be wholesome. For many working families, this illusion was enough. It is strangely comical that people trusted colour more than content, as if golden shine could make a poison pure. The imitation butter came wrapped in paper marked with images of cows and meadows, though not a trace of milk had ever touched it. Its main ingredients were pig fat boiled until it lost its smell, mixed with melted candle wax for firmness and tinted with bright yellow dye. Some recipes even used clay powder to thicken the texture. In small kitchens across the city, women scraped it onto bread and fed it to their children before dawn. It tasted greasy but familiar. The poor had little time for questions about origins. When hunger spoke, curiosity went silent. Factories that produced it worked around the clock. Inside, the heat was suffocating. Workers stood ankle-deep in mixtures of grease and wax, stirring vats with wooden paddles that glistened with oil. The air smelled of tallow and dye, a chemical sweetness that clung to skin and hair. Inspectors rarely entered these places. When they did, the owners offered tea and conversation until the smell of ammonia became normal. The product left the factory solid and glossy, packed into paper blocks with printed cows smiling proudly. For shopkeepers, it was a gift. True butter spoiled quickly and was costly to store. This substitute stayed firm for months, no matter the temperature. Its profit margin was higher, its appearance convincing. Even the upper classes began to buy it unknowingly, as some merchants mixed real butter with imitation and sold it at full price. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like blending soap into cheese and marketing it as a healthy choice. The deceit was elegant, and the appetite for illusion endless. The human cost was hidden behind politeness. Those who ate it daily began to suffer mysterious ailments. Their stomachs churned, their skin broke out in red patches, and their tongues felt raw after every meal. Some blamed stress. Others thought it was the bad air of the cities. Few realized the cause lay in the golden spread they praised for its thriftiness. Doctors called the condition industrial fatigue or digestive irregularity, comforting terms that avoided guilt. The manufacturers blamed the customers, insisting the poor did not store it properly. In homes of the wealthy, debates began about adulterated foods, but words rarely turned into laws. Newspapers reported scandalous cases of coloured fat being sold as butter, then quickly shifted to stories about royal dinners and social events. Commerce depended on forgetfulness. Factories renamed their products, reprinted their labels, and continued as before. There is something disturbing about how a society could swallow deception so willingly just to feel civilized. The yellow colour became a symbol of improvement, a badge of having joined the modern age. Street markets were filled with its smell. Vendors shouted about freshness, slicing slabs of the imitation spread and handing out samples on small pieces of bread. The wax made it shine under the afternoon sun, a fake promise of nourishment that even children believed. Those who could not afford meat relied on it for calories, spreading it over boiled potatoes or dipping hard crusts into it. After eating, nausea was common, but it passed and hunger returned, creating an endless cycle of craving and sickness. Chemists who examined samples found residues of lead from the colouring agents and traces of cleaning chemicals used to neutralise the stench of animal fat. Yet few dared to challenge the growing industry. Food had become a matter of economy, not safety. If it filled the stomach, it was considered good enough. The poor could not afford purity, and purity itself had been redefined to mean appearance rather than truth. I can almost see one of those kitchens now, dimly lit by a single candle, where a mother spreads the golden imitation across a slice of bread. Her child smiles at the colour, believing it to be rich butter. She watches with relief, not realising she has served sickness disguised as comfort. The illusion of warmth was easier to bear than the reality of hunger. As years passed, the fake butter became part of daily life. Its presence on the table no longer raised questions. Those who suffered from it simply learned to endure. Reformers spoke of labelling and inspection, but manufacturers argued that the people did not want the truth, only cheap food that looked respectable. It was an argument that history would hear again and again. The story of the golden spread reveals how appearance replaced honesty and comfort replaced health. As the yellow glow filled homes, another kind of counterfeit would soon tempt the sweet-toothed with colours even brighter. Beneath the sugar icing and pink glazes, danger would hide again, this time in the shape of beautiful little cakes that promised elegance but carried death. Afternoon light fell through lace curtains, turning every tablecloth pale and every teacup bright. The ritual of cake and conversation was one of the few luxuries that women of the Victorian middle class could claim as their own. Plates of sponge and tart rested beside porcelain cups, their surfaces painted with delicate pinks, yellows, and greens that looked almost too perfect to eat. The sweetness was meant to symbolise refinement, a gesture of elegance and control in a world that offered women little else. But what appeared graceful on the surface was slowly killing them. The soft pastel colours that decorated these cakes were not made from fruit or flour, but from chemicals ground in apothecaries and paint shops. Each bite carried traces of lead, mercury, and copper. It is darkly ironic that women chasing elegance ended up swallowing the same substances used to polish mirrors and paint walls. In bakeries across London, confectioners competed to produce the most beautiful desserts. Their windows glittered with rows of cakes that looked like jewels, stacked high on silver trays. Behind the scenes, the dyes came from bottles marked with skulls. The pinks were born from lead oxide, the greens from copper sulfate, and the whites from arsenic powder. Flour was bleached with alum to make it whiter still, and the frosting was stiffened with chalk to hold its shape under the heat of candles. When these creations were brought out at tea gatherings, women gasped in admiration. They saw artistry, not danger. The taste of sugar and almond hid the bitterness of the poison. The pleasure was instant. The pain came later. Lips tingled, throats burned faintly, and a metallic taste lingered unnoticed. The symptoms appeared hours later as nausea, headaches, or trembling hands. Some fainted quietly at the table, dismissed as weak or emotional. Doctors rarely suspected the dessert. Illness in women was easily explained by nerves, not by food. It was easier to believe that fainting came from emotion than from pastry. At social gatherings, refusing a slice of cake was considered rude. Hostesses took pride in their selections, often ordering from famous patisseries that used the most vivid colours. Pink meant delicacy, green meant freshness, and gold meant wealth. The brighter the hue, the higher the status of the table. Housewives learned to copy these fashions, using cheap dyes sold in markets to decorate their own cakes. The powders came in unlabeled paper packets, cheap and plentiful. No one asked what they were made of. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like decorating cupcakes with powdered battery acid and calling them handmade treats. The absurdity seems impossible, yet it was reality for generations. The story of the 16-year-old girl spread quietly through newspapers. She had attended a small tea gathering with her mother and friends, laughing as she reached for the pink cakes. Within hours, she fell violently ill, her stomach twisting, her breathing shallow. By nightfall, she was gone. The cause was never written clearly in the report, but those who saw the remains of the cakes knew. The same dye had been used in wallpaper, known to cause death in children who licked the walls of nurseries. Yet it was also approved for food because it made pastries beautiful. It is horrifying how refinement could demand such sacrifices, as if grace required a body count. Women continued to buy the same cakes, the same colours, believing that tragedy struck only the careless. To appear pale, delicate, and well-mannered mattered more than to live without illness. The sight of pink icing was a comfort, a signal that they were part of the civilized world. Chemists warned of danger, publishing lists of toxic ingredients found in common sweets. Some governments discussed labelling laws, but trade interests resisted. Merchants claimed that removing the dyes would ruin the charm of confectionery and hurt business. Mothers continued to serve them, daughters continued to eat them, and the illusion of safety persisted. Cakes remained on every tea table, each slice a quiet gamble between appearance and survival. I imagine the stillness of one of those rooms, the sound of porcelain clinking and polite laughter echoing faintly. The air smells of sugar and perfume, but beneath it lies something acrid. A young woman lifts her fork, smiling, her gloved hand steady. The frosting glistens, the pink delicate as blush. She does not know that her beauty will cost her breath. As the craze for coloured pastries spread, bakers found new ways to deepen hues and lower costs. They ground metallic powders finer, mixed them with starch, and called them refined pigments. Magazines praised the visual splendour of modern baking. Housewives collected recipes without realising they were collecting poisons. Every bite became a silent partnership with death, one that society preferred to ignore. By the end of the century, reformers finally drew attention to the bodies left behind by beauty. The same public that once adored coloured frosting began to fear it. Yet even then, few condemned the vanity that had demanded it. The cakes were replaced by other inventions just as dangerous, promising modernity with every bite. The story of the deadly cakes revealed how fashion could twist into poison, turning grace into grief. From bakery shelves to market stalls, the hunger for beauty continued to outpace the hunger for truth, and in the glow of the gaslight, a new form of sweetness waited, gleaming in bottles that promised energy but delivered only illness. In the narrow back streets behind the markets, smoke rose from iron pots that never stopped boiling. The smell was thick and sour, a mixture of grease and decay that clung to clothes long after one had passed by. These were the hidden workshops where cooking oil for the poor was made. It did not come from olives or seeds, but from the bodies of dead animals collected at dawn. Dogs, horses, rats, and livestock left to rot on the roadside were dragged away by men with carts and hooks. They paid small coins to butchers for scraps and bones, then melted everything together in vats. The result was a dark, heavy liquid that glimmered faintly in the light, looking almost respectable when poured into glass bottles. Vendors sold it cheaply to food stalls and street cooks, who used it to fry potatoes, fish, and dough. For many working families, this oil was a necessity. Clean fat was expensive and spoiled quickly. The recycled kind cost only a fraction, and once it was heated, the smell seemed to vanish. The sound of frying comforted the hungry, filling the air with a promise of warmth and flavour. Few wanted to know what simmered beneath that promise. It is cruelly amusing that hunger could turn the smell of rot into something that felt like home. The process was simple but horrifying. Bones were broken into pieces and boiled for hours, releasing a cloudy fat that floated to the top. The liquid was skimmed, cooled, and strained through dirty cloths to remove hair and dirt. To hide the rancid odour, cheap perfumes and chemical scents were stirred in, often the same oils used in soap or candles. Sometimes, a bit of colourant was added to make it appear golden, like fresh vegetable oil. The mixture was poured into reused bottles collected from taverns and apothecaries, then sold at open markets without labels. When the bottles were placed side by side in the sunlight, they looked harmless. Customers chose by brightness, not by origin. Street cooks poured it into large pans and dropped in handfuls of food. The oil hissed and spat, coating everything in a thin crust that smelled, at least from a distance, almost pleasant. But those who ate from these stools often suffered afterward. Their throats burned, their stomachs cramped, and strange fevers followed. The oil contained not only decomposed fat but also traces of disease. Parasites and bacteria survived the rough boiling, hiding in the murky residue. No one tested, no one cared. Food inspectors existed only for the rich districts. In the poorer quarters, everything that sizzled was considered edible. In many ways, the system fed itself. The same people who bought the fried food were those whose waste later became part of the next batch of oil. Nothing was wasted in Victorian cities. Animals that died in the streets were dragged away by scavengers before the city carts arrived. Even the tanners sold leftover fat to the renderers. Human hunger transformed every corpse into profit. The line between food and refuse blurred completely. Newspapers occasionally reported scandals about poison oil, but the attention faded quickly. Editors called them isolated incidents, accidents of poor hygiene. The truth was structural. The industrial world had created a population too poor to afford purity, yet too hungry to refuse danger. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like filling your frying pan with the runoff from a garbage truck and calling it street food. The comparison sounds grotesque, but the logic remains the same. Survival justifies anything that keeps the stomach full. In the crowded markets, the fried scent was irresistible. Vendors shouted about freshness, waving wooden tongs over pans of bubbling oil. Golden crusts gleamed on the surface, hiding the bitterness beneath. Crowds gathered around, exchanging coins for paper parcels of fried potatoes and fish. The first bite was always satisfying. The crunch silenced doubt, and the salt distracted the tongue from the metallic aftertaste. Children especially loved the cheap fried cakes sold in alleys. They cost only a penny, sweetened with sugar that had once been bleached with lime. I can almost imagine one of those evenings when workers finished long shifts and drifted toward the smell of frying. The air was damp with soot and fog, yet the sizzling sound seemed inviting. A man might hand over his last coins for a portion of fish, the oil dripping through the paper onto his hands. He would eat quickly, too hungry to notice the acrid sting at the back of his throat. For a few moments, he felt full, and that was enough. By morning, the nausea would come, followed by a fever that doctors called market sickness. Authorities eventually took notice when entire neighbourhoods reported similar symptoms. Samples of oil were tested, revealing traces of decomposed tissue and even fragments of bone. Officials expressed outrage, but enforcement proved impossible. Every new law drove the trade further underground. Renderers simply changed addresses and continued at night. The city's hunger was too large, its poverty too deep. Demand never disappeared. The same oil that caused illness one week was back in frying pans the next. It is unsettling to think how the line between necessity and filth became invisible, how people could taste sickness and still call it sustenance. Clean food was not a right but a privilege. Those who could afford olive oil or fresh butter looked down upon the poor for their choices, ignoring that it was poverty itself that poisoned them. doctors began to write reports about chronic digestive diseases in working-class districts. The patients shared the same symptoms: stomach pain, dizziness, exhaustion, and pale skin. Some suffered for years, their bodies weakened by slow intoxication. Yet the solution was always moral, never structural. The poor were told to eat better, as if choice existed where hunger ruled. The city continued to breathe the smell of frying, its alleys filled with the sound of survival cooking in rancid oil. By the late century, reformers tried to create cooperatives that would sell clean cooking fat at fair prices. Their efforts met resistance from traders who profited from the old system. Cheap oil meant cheap food, and cheap food meant calm streets. Keeping the poor fed, no matter how badly, kept them working. The illusion of nourishment was enough to maintain order. I picture those pots simmering in the shadows, their surfaces shimmering with greasy rainbows under the dim lamps. The same liquid that had boiled the bones of horses now bubbled beneath the fish that fed a child. The smell carried through the alleys, thick and sweetened with perfume, wrapping the city in a haze of false comfort. This was progress, industrial and efficient, turning death itself into dinner. The tale of recycled oil reveals how survival can disguise corruption until it becomes the same thing. From alleys and stalls, the scent of frying drifted into homes, teaching people to accept decay as normal. Yet beyond those flickering flames waited another deception, a sweetness wrapped in paper that children craved, made not from sugar but from acid and bleach. In the bustling streets of Victorian cities, candy sellers stood at every corner with glass jars glittering in the weak sunlight. Inside them were neat rows of white lozenges that promised a moment of sweetness and coolness in lives otherwise filled with smoke and dust. The candy was cheap, clean-looking, and easy to love. Children crowded around the stalls, pointing at the shiny mints that seemed almost magical. Mothers bought them by the handful, happy to bring home something harmless that made their children smile. Yet those tiny white tablets were far from innocent. They were born not from sugarcane or mint leaves, but from acid, borax, and chalk ground together in the dim light of laboratories. It is grimly absurd that something used to scrub floors could also be used to sweeten a child's tongue. The secret behind the candy's refreshing coolness lay in chemistry, not nature. Genuine mint oil was expensive, so factory owners turned to synthetic flavourings made by dissolving camphor and acids into alcohol. The result was sharp and invigorating, a sensation that burned rather than soothed. To make the mixture sweet, they used borax, a compound better known for cleaning pots and disinfecting sinks. It was cheaper than sugar and lasted longer on the shelf. Workers poured it into moulds, pressing the powder into perfect circles that gleamed like snow. From a distance, they looked pure. Up close, they carried the faint smell of soap and metal. Factories that produced the lozenges were dark, cramped places where the air itself seemed to sting the nose. The workers, often girls barely in their teens, spent hours mixing powders that made their eyes water. White dust clung to their hair and clothes, coating their skin with a pale film. Many of them coughed constantly, their throats raw from the fumes, but the pay, however small, was better than starving. When the foreman shouted, they worked faster, pressing hundreds of candies each hour. Once dried and wrapped in paper, the sweets went to market stalls labelled mint refreshers, promising purity and pleasure for only a few pennies. Children loved the first taste. The lozenge dissolved quickly, releasing a burst of coldness that felt like breathing winter air. Street sellers claimed it was good for sore throats and heat exhaustion. Mothers kept packets of them in drawers beside sewing kits, handing them to restless children as small treats. No one suspected danger. The connection between the laboratory and the candy jar was invisible. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like giving children breath mints made from bleach and calling it medicine. The sweetness dulled the tongue, but the poison worked deeper. Soon, strange symptoms appeared. children complained of burning mouths, aching bellies, and dizziness. Some vomited violently after eating several lozenges. Doctors were puzzled, blaming spoiled milk or damp air. A few who examined the candies noticed their chalky residue and strong chemical scent, but lacked the tools to prove anything. Illness was common enough that few questioned its cause. Death from sweets seemed unthinkable, almost laughable. In truth, the ingredients were never meant for human consumption. Borax damaged the stomach lining, and acid sulfuric left traces of corrosion in the throat. Combined with alum and starch, they created a perfect imitation of peppermint candy, white, crisp, and deadly. The factories produced them by the ton, sending shipments across towns and villages. Advertising posters showed smiling children holding sticks of candy, their eyes bright with innocence. The same images that sold comfort also concealed horror. Parents trusted what was affordable. Real sugar was costly, and genuine mint oil came from distant colonies. Synthetic substitutes promised the same pleasure for less. The choice was easy when every penny mattered. In the evening, after long days of work, mothers might hand a lozenge to a coughing child, believing it soothing. The child smiled, sucked quietly, and soon fell ill. It is haunting to imagine those moments when care itself became a cause of suffering. Street hawkers had no reason to stop selling. When a child died, they blamed bad luck or weak health. The crowds kept coming, and the jars kept emptying. Even when officials received reports of poisonings, they hesitated. Shutting down a factory meant unemployment, and unemployment meant unrest. The balance of profit and poverty always outweighed conscience. Chemists who tried to expose the practice faced ridicule. Factory owners called them alarmists, accusing them of trying to destroy progress. They argued that people had eaten the lozenges for years without issue, ignoring how many children simply disappeared without a record. In the crowded slums, death was too common to count. There were no statistics, only grief buried beneath exhaustion. The moral panic that should have followed never came. Society was too accustomed to danger to care, when life itself was precarious. The idea that a piece of candy could kill felt trivial. The poor were expected to take risks. Safety was reserved for those who could afford it. Mint lozenges continued to line the shelves, cheap and gleaming, their whiteness a symbol of trust in an age that valued appearances above all else. I can picture one of those stalls near a factory gate, where tired workers stopped to buy a penny's worth of candy before heading home. The seller scooped a handful into paper, smiling as he called out to the children. The street was dark, the air heavy with soot. The little ones laughed, unwrapping their treats, unaware that each bite was a chemical disguised as kindness. Their parents watched fondly, never realizing they were feeding them pain. As night fell, the lamps along the street reflected off the glass jars, making the white candy shine brighter than ever. The sight was strangely beautiful, a comfort to those who passed by. To them, it was proof that even in poverty, sweetness could still exist. But the light only made the illusion stronger, the danger more invisible. The candies kept selling, and the city kept swallowing them, one small piece of poison at a time. The story of the mint candy shows how innocence can be manufactured from cruelty and sold without shame. From factory dust to children's laughter, every step was built on ignorance turned into habit. And beyond those glass jars, another kind of deception waited, painted in golden yellow, where even the spices meant to flavour food carried the same deadly disguise. The shelves of Victorian grocers were lined with bright jars and bottles that gleamed like jewels under the gaslight. Their colours were too vivid to be natural, glowing yellows, deep reds, and dark greens that promised flavour and freshness. Housewives admired the sight, believing the brilliance of colour meant purity. They bought mustard, ketchup, and spices by the ounce, proud to serve meals that looked as cheerful as the advertisements claimed. Yet beneath the glass and paint, the contents were anything but fresh. The mustard that seemed golden like sunlight owed its colour not to seeds, but to chemical powders used in textile factories. The ketchup that looked rich and red came from spoiled tomatoes fermented in vats and tinted with dyes made from iron and lead. Every spoonful carried a piece of industry's waste, transformed into something people trusted enough to eat. It is both sad and ridiculous that a colour once meant to brighten cloth ended up staining stomachs instead. Mustard was especially prized. Its sharpness was considered a sign of the good taste, a mark of refinement. In kitchens across the city, people stirred spoonfuls of the yellow paste into sauces, or spread it over meat to hide the smell of age. But few knew that the vivid hue came from lead chromate, a pigment once used to paint furniture. The poison gave the mustard its brightness and longevity. Without it, the mixture would turn dull and brown within days. Grocers blended the powder by hand, often coughing as they worked, their fingers yellowed from the dust. Some developed sores that refused to heal. Still, the demand for brightness grew. The public associated dull colour with decay, and merchants simply met that expectation. The story of ketchup was even more unpleasant. Tomatoes rotted quickly, especially in warm weather. To avoid loss, sellers mashed the spoiled ones into paste, mixed them with vinegar, and boiled the mixture until the smell subsided. To restore its red colour, they added Venetian red, a pigment made from iron oxide and mercury. The metallic taste was hidden under spices and sugar. The result was a sauce that looked perfect in glass bottles, thick and smooth, its colour suggesting ripeness and health. Families poured it freely over meat and bread, never realising it carried the same ingredients used to tint brick and polish leather. Spices, too, became victims of deception. Pepper was mixed with powdered husks, cinnamon with sawdust, and curry powder with ground clay and yellow dye. Every flavour was stretched to earn more profit. Even tea was coloured with copper salts to make it appear fresh and green. The deceit spread so widely that genuine products became rare luxuries. For the poor, imitation was normal. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like seasoning food with crushed paint chips and calling it gourmet cooking. The absurdity is hard to imagine now, yet it was a daily act of trust and survival. Chemists who examined samples of these condiments were alarmed. They found high levels of lead and arsenic, substances that accumulated in the body over time. Victims did not die quickly. The poison worked slowly, numbing the limbs, turning skin pale, and dulling the mind. Housewives complained of fatigue and joint pain, symptoms that doctors dismissed as hysteria or poor constitution. Children lost their appetite, and their lips were faintly blue from lead poisoning. None connected these signs to the bright sauces on their tables. It is disturbing how beauty became a measure of safety, and dullness a sign of neglect. The same families who feared dirt in the streets consumed poison for the sake of colour. In a world obsessed with appearances, even taste had to look beautiful. Merchants understood this perfectly. They sold not food, but the illusion of care, bottling deceit in every shade of gold and red. Street markets thrived on these illusions. Vendors scooped mustard from barrels, its scent sharp enough to sting the eyes, its brightness too intense to be real. They poured ketchup into small jars, sealing them with wax that already smelled faintly metallic. Customers lined up, drawn by colour as much as price. Once home, they placed the bottles proudly on their shelves beside bread and sugar, unaware that they had purchased poison disguised as prosperity. Doctors occasionally raised alarms in medical journals. They described families suffering from chronic illness and traced it to contaminated condiments, but without enforcement, their warnings faded. Lawmakers hesitated to interfere with trade. The growing empire needed exports, and food colourings were cheap to make and easy to sell. Industry expanded under the banner of progress, staining kitchens across Britain with the colours of commerce. In the poorest districts, Street food became a rainbow of toxins. Fried fish was brushed with yellow paste to seem fresh, and pickled vegetables glowed with unnatural hues. Even soup sellers used powders to tint their broth, claiming it added strength. People learned to equate colour with health. The dull, natural shades of real food looked suspicious by comparison. As long as the colours shone bright, no one questioned their source. I can almost picture a narrow kitchen, the walls grey with soot, where a mother stirs a pot of stew that smells faintly metallic. She adds a spoonful of mustard, watching the mixture turn golden, smiling because it looks rich and wholesome. Her children wait with their bowls, eager and trusting. They eat without hesitation, and she feels proud that dinner looks as fine as that of wealthier families. The deception is complete, not through malice, but through necessity. By the end of the century, cases of chronic poisoning became too numerous to ignore. Reformers demanded food inspection laws, arguing that beauty had no right to be deadly. Their voices met resistance from traders and manufacturers who claimed regulation would ruin the economy. It took decades before real change occurred, and even then, the cheap colours never truly disappeared. They simply found new disguises, new forms, new promises. The tale of coloured condiments reveals how vanity seeped into hunger, turning nourishment into spectacle. From golden mustard to red sauces, every meal became a performance built on deceit. And as these false flavours spread through kitchens, another invention waited, sealed inside small tins and advertised as health itself. Carrying poison meant not for flavour but for strength. Afternoon tea among the Victorian elite was considered the height of sophistication. In drawing rooms filled with the scent of roses and linen, women sat gracefully, their gloved hands resting beside delicate china cups. Servants moved quietly between them, offering trays of sandwiches, biscuits, and small pastries. To any visitor, it looked like a portrait of refinement and control. Yet beneath the calm surface lay something far less graceful. The foods that defined elegance were slowly poisoning the women who ate them. Each bite of their carefully arranged meals carried hidden rot, chemical dyes, and toxins disguised as fashion. It is painfully ironic that the rituals meant to protect their health and beauty were the very things that destroyed them. The sandwiches, so thin and dainty, were often made from slices of meat kept for days without ice. Refrigeration was rare and expensive, and even the homes of the wealthy could not escape the heat of summer. To preserve the illusion of freshness, servants brushed the meat with vinegar or lemon water before serving. The smell faded, but the decay did not. Between layers of bread spread with imitation butter, the spoiled meat sat waiting. Guests chewed politely, smiling, unaware that bacteria were already spreading in their mouths. Food poisoning was a common but silent guest at those tables. When sickness followed, it was attributed to delicate nerves, not spoiled sandwiches. The tea they drank was no safer. Genuine leaves were costly, so merchants often sold mixtures of spent tea leaves dried again, coloured with copper salts to restore their greenish tint. The flavour was harsh, so women softened it with milk that had already begun to ferment. To make the mixture appear appealing, some producers added blue and green dyes, turning the drink into a pastel shade admired for its novelty. The taste was faintly metallic, the texture thick. But in the world of etiquette, appearance mattered more than comfort. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like sipping detergent tinted with milk and calling it a health drink. The absurdity of it was invisible behind porcelain and politeness. At the heart of this slow self-destruction was an obsession with control. To be a proper lady meant moderation, restraint, and the appearance of perfect composure. Food was not a pleasure but a discipline. Women measured their meals carefully, priding themselves on eating less than those around them. Entire books were written on how to appear delicate and refined through small appetites. When the first diet biscuits appeared, advertised as slimming aids, They became instant symbols of self-mastery. No one cared that they were laced with arsenic. The same poison once used to kill rats was now marketed as a tool for beauty. The biscuits were pale, dry, and faintly sweet, made with ground rice, flour, and a small amount of arsenic trioxide. They promised to suppress hunger and clarify the complexion. Women bought them eagerly, believing that paleness was the mark of nobility. After all, doctors themselves endorsed arsenic in small doses as a tonic. The line between medicine and poison blurred completely. Women who ate them regularly began to lose weight, then energy, then colour. Their nails turned brittle, their hair thinned, and faint sores appeared along their skin. Yet they smiled through their exhaustion, proud of their restraint. It is deeply unsettling to imagine a society that calls sickness beauty and calls poison virtue. The faintness and weakness that followed were interpreted as signs of refinement. Friends complimented one another on their fragility, mistaking decay for grace. Even when women fainted at gatherings, others admired their delicacy. The culture turned self-destruction into elegance. Meanwhile, the social world revolved around these meals. To skip tea was to risk exclusion. Invitations were social currency, and attendance proved one's place among the respectable. Women forced themselves to eat the food served, even when their stomachs rebelled. They laughed softly over cups of tainted tea, sharing recipes for slimming powders and mint pastilles that calm the appetite. Beneath the gentle chatter, their bodies weakened together in silence. Servants saw what their employers could not. They watched the meat grow darker each day, the milk souring in the jug, the biscuits crumbling into dust. They saw their mistresses pale and tired, yet still demanding the same meals. Some whispered of curses or bad air, unable to believe that elegance itself could be lethal. The truth was more ordinary, and therefore more cruel. It was not fate, but fashion. Doctors began to notice patterns among their female patients. They reported chronic nausea, fainting, and fatigue, but dismissed them as hysteria. The real cause was on their tables, not in their minds. The medical journals of the time contained case after case of nervous weakness that could easily have been arsenic poisoning, yet no one thought to question the biscuits or the beauty tonics. To challenge the trend was to question the ideal of the perfect Victorian lady, something few dared to do. The tragedy was quiet, without drama or spectacle. Women did not die suddenly. They withered, day by day, believing their suffering was refinement. The mirror told them they looked pale and fragile, which meant success. The more they hurt, the more beautiful they were told they had become. No rebellion, no outcry, just the slow acceptance of pain as elegance. In their parlours, surrounded by lace and soft light, they sipped their pale tea and nibbled their poisoned biscuits, believing they were living correctly. Outside, the city grew darker, louder, and more industrial, but inside, the rituals remained the same. To question them would be to step outside the world that defined their worth. And so they continued, smiling faintly, dying beautifully. The tale of these delicate meals reveals how luxury can rot quietly behind manners and lace. From sandwiches to tea and biscuits, every bite became a rehearsal for death disguised as refinement. Beyond those polished tea tables, the same poisons crept into the streets, feeding the hungry through frying pans filled with oil rendered from death itself. The smell of fried fish filled the narrow lanes of Victorian London, drifting from open stalls where oil hissed and smoke clung to the air. To many, that scent was comfort itself. It meant a warm meal after hours of labour, something rich enough to dull the ache of hunger. Crowds gathered around wooden carts, coins ready, drawn by the promise of crispy batter and salt. Few wondered where the fish came from, or what lived inside it. The truth was simple, but hidden in plain sight. The fish that fed the city were pulled from the Thames, a river so polluted it was said to breathe sickness. The water carried everything that industry and humanity cast off: ashes, chemicals, and sewage flowing together in a grey tide. It is almost comical that people trusted what floated in filth simply because it was fried until golden. Fishermen hauled in their catches at dawn, their boats heavy with creatures slicked in slime and waste. Some fish were already dying before they reached the docks, their gills black from the water. They were sold cheaply to street vendors, who saw no need to waste good profit on freshness. A quick wash in brine, a coating of flour, and a dip into hot oil could transform anything into food. The heat made the skin crisp and the smell inviting, covering all traces of decay. No one could tell by sight or scent what waited beneath the surface. The vendors worked fast, their pans bubbling over open fires. Oil spattered their aprons, blackened by use and thick with residue from earlier batches. Each day's frying began with the same oil as the day before, reused until it turned dark and heavy. When mixed with flour and grease, it created a thick coating that trapped everything inside: the parasites, the bacteria, the remnants of pollution. Customers lined up eagerly, holding scraps of paper or leaves to carry their portions. The food was hot, cheap, and filling. That was all that mattered. Children loved the crunchy edges, the sound they made when bitten. Workers grabbed pieces on their way home, eating quickly as they walked. The taste was satisfying, the salt sharp enough to awaken tired bodies. But within hours, stomachs began to churn. Diarrhea, fever, and stomach pain followed like clockwork. Few connected these symptoms to the fried fish that had seemed so harmless. In the crowded tenements, illness was common, and food was rarely blamed. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like buying dinner straight from a sewage pipe and trusting that seasoning could save it. The thought feels absurd. Yet for the Victorian poor, it was daily life. Doctors and health inspectors occasionally test samples from the markets. What they found was alarming parasites surviving the heat, their eggs clinging to flesh, and traces of industrial metals embedded in the meat. Mercury from factories, arsenic from dyes, and lead from runoff. All of it gathered in the river's depths before landing on the plates of the poor. Even the act of frying could not purify what the river had made foul. But these findings rarely reached the people who needed to know. Reports were buried under bureaucracy or dismissed as exaggerated. For the vendors, business thrived. They were not cruel, only practical. The poor could not afford clean food, and the vendors could not afford to buy it. The balance of survival was built on shared denial. People knew the river was filthy, yet they still relied on it. They believed that the oil's heat burned away the danger, that the crackling sound meant safety. It was a fragile kind of faith, born from hunger and exhaustion. It is unsettling how easily people can convince themselves that danger disappears once it tastes good. At night, the same river that poisoned them shimmered faintly under the gaslights. Its surface rippled with scum and ash, yet fishermen returned each morning. They brought back more catches, more hope, more quiet death. Women cleaned the fish in their basins, their hands raw from the cold, unaware of the invisible life crawling inside the flesh. They cooked for their families, proud to serve a warm meal. When sickness came, they blamed the air or the dampness of their rooms. The idea that dinner itself carried the cause was unthinkable. Authorities talked about river reform, but progress was slow. The industries along the Thames poured waste unchecked, staining the water with dyes and chemicals. The same pollution that ruined the river also made cheap fish plentiful. In the logic of poverty, that was enough. As long as the markets were full, no one dared to ask where the supply came from. In the early morning, when the fog still clung to the bridges, carts carried barrels of fish to the markets. The smell was sharp, half salt, half rot. The vendors opened them without flinching, slicing fillets with practiced speed. They had seen worse. By midday, the first batches were frying again, sizzling in the same oil that had cooked yesterday's meal. The cycle continued endlessly, feeding the city with poison that no one could see but everyone could taste. I can almost picture the scene: a narrow street, oil popping, the air thick with heat and smoke. A child holds a piece of fish wrapped in old newspaper, his face lit by the glow of the fire. He eats quickly, licking his fingers, his mother smiling at his appetite. She does not know that the same river that bathed the city's filth has now entered her child's body. The comfort of a full stomach is brief, but hunger always returns. By the end of the century, the Thames was infamous, its stench so strong that Parliament itself could no longer ignore it. Reforms followed, slow and uneven, but too late for countless lives shaped by poverty and contamination. The fried fish tradition survived, transformed over time into a national dish, its origins buried beneath nostalgia. No one likes to remember that it began in the stench of a poisoned river. The story of fried fish reveals how hunger can make people trade safety for satisfaction, turning pollution into a meal. From the river's filth to the frying pans of the poor, decay disguised itself as comfort. Beyond those smoky stalls, another illusion of purity awaited, a loaf so white it gleamed, hiding the powder and poison mixed into every crumb. In the bakeries of Victorian England, the scent of fresh bread drifted through narrow streets long before sunrise. Rows of golden loaves cooled on wooden shelves, their soft white interiors glowing beneath the lamplight. To many, that whiteness was a symbol of success. The poor bought brown bread, coarse and heavy, but the wealthy demanded bread as pale as linen. It was a mark of refinement, proof that one had risen above the grime of labour. Housewives displayed it proudly at breakfast tables, unaware that its purity was a lie. The colour that promised health came not from better grain, but from the dust of industry, chalk, alum, and powdered gypsum mixed directly into the flour. It is grimly amusing that people believe the closer food looked to marble, the safer it must be. Milling had once been a simple craft. Grain was ground between stones, its natural oils giving the flour a warm, golden tint. But with the rise of industrial production, everything changed. Machines could grind faster, cheaper, and finer, stripping away the germ and bran that gave flour its colour and nutrition. What remained was bland and dull. To make it white again, millers added chemicals meant for plaster and paint. Thatched sow, the same material used to coat walls, was ground to dust and stirred into the mix. The result was bright, smooth, and lifeless. Merchants sold it as refined, a word that came to mean not pure but hollow. The deception worked perfectly. Customers judge bread by appearance, not flavour. Bakers competed to produce the whitest loaves, polishing their reputation one shade paler at a time. In window displays, the bread looked like carved stone, soft yet gleaming. Women pointed to it proudly, telling their guests that it was the finest kind. No one asked what made it so white. Even when stomach cramps and fatigue became common after meals, few blamed the bread. Food poisoning was still a mystery to most, and illness was simply part of life. The poor watched with envy. White bread became a dream of respectability, a small proof that life could be clean and civilized. To serve it was to show progress, even if it meant sickness later. Some spent half their wages on small loaves just to feel equal to their employers. The contrast between the rich and the poor grew not just in money, but in colour, the pale against the brown, the polished against the rough. The empire had turned shade into status. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like painting vegetables with bleach to prove success. The idea sounds grotesque, yet that was how society measured purity. Bakers knew the risks but rarely stopped. The chemicals kept the dough from spoiling, made it rise higher, and produced loaves that stayed soft longer on the shelf. These qualities meant profit. Even when inspectors warned of digestive troubles linked to alum and gypsum, the response was silence. The appetite for perfection outweighed safety concerns. Factories ran day and night, the air filled with white powder that settled on floors, tables, and lungs. Workers coughed constantly, their hands cracked from lime dust, their teeth crumbling from exposure. Bread, once a symbol of nourishment, had become an agent of slow decay. Doctors began to notice patterns among their patients' stomach pains, bloating, and constant weakness. They called it the London malady, a vague term that covered every illness tied to industrial life. The cause sat on every dining table, disguised as progress. Reformers tried to sound alarms, but their warnings were drowned by advertisements boasting of snow-white quality. Newspapers printed images of happy families cutting into perfect loaves, smiling beside slogans about purity and civilization. The irony was invisible to most. It is disturbing how the pursuit of cleanliness made people consume dust meant for walls. At home, women believed they were feeding their families the best. They had been taught that dark bread was for labourers, that white bread meant refinement. The illusion shaped daily life. Mothers packed it into children's lunches, servants served it to employers, and no one questioned the pain that followed. The bread filled the stomach, but not the body. Malnutrition spread quietly, hidden behind the polished image of abundance. In the factories, the sound of grinding never stopped. The wheels turned over sacks of grain mixed with white powder, filling the air with a mist that settled on every surface. The men who worked there aged quickly, their skin dry, their hair brittle. Yet the demand kept rising. Bread was cheap, reliable, and easy to ship. It became the foundation of the Victorian diet, the very thing that defined stability, while slowly eroding the health of those who depended on it most. The deception was so complete that even when samples were tested and found to contain the cacao, the public refused to believe it. Trust in progress ran too deep. People could see the whiteness, they could taste the softness. These were the proofs of modernity, and they were beautiful. Admitting that beauty could harm was too painful. The idea that industry could poison the nation's daily bread struck too close to home. Denial was easier, cheaper, and far more comfortable. I can almost picture a bakery window on a cold morning, light spilling over rows of perfect loaves. A woman stops outside, admiring the brightness. She buys one, clutching it close as if holding a piece of refinement itself. At home, she slices it carefully for her children, proud of its colour, reassured by its smoothness. She never thinks about the dust rising from the crust, or the pain that will return to their bellies before nightfall. By the end of the century, when inspectors finally enforced stricter laws on adulteration, habits had already been formed. The white loaf remained the standard of respectability, even as it lost its poison. The belief that beauty meant safety endured long after the evidence vanished. The people had learned to prefer illusion to nourishment, and no reform could change that taste. The story of the white loaf reveals how aspiration can turn sustenance into deception, trading nourishment for appearance. From the millstones to the marketplace, purity became a product rather than a virtue. Beyond those spotless bakeries, the illusion of cleanliness deepened further, as the same obsession with freshness led vendors to wash food in the chemicals used to preserve the dead. The streets of Victorian cities never slept. Even after dusk, rows of food stalls glowed under gas lamps, their tables crowded with jars of pickles, trays of salad, and bowls of sliced fruit glistening under damp cloths. The colours looked vivid, the textures crisp, the smell faintly sweet. To the working poor who had little access to fresh produce, these stalls promised a taste of something alive in a world built from soot and iron. Housewives bought handfuls of pickled vegetables to brighten dull meals, and labourers quenched their thirst with cold slices of cucumber sprinkled with salt. Yet beneath this illusion of freshness lay something that belonged not in kitchens but in morgues. The same chemical used to preserve corpses was now used to preserve food. It is darkly funny that the living learned to borrow tricks from the dead just to keep their vegetables from rotting. Formalin, a diluted form of formaldehyde, had been a recent invention, a marvel of industrial science designed to stop decay. In laboratories, it hardened flesh and arrested decomposition. In the hands of street vendors, it performed the same miracle on cabbage and cucumbers. A quick rinse made wilted vegetables firm again, their colours brightened, their scent neutralised. Pickles that should have soured after a day now lasted for weeks. No one could see the difference, and few cared to ask how it was done. Cleanliness was rare, and anything that appeared untouched by dirt seemed worth buying. The vendors were practical, not malicious. They fought against heat, dust, and time. Each morning, they washed their produce in barrels filled with a clear solution that stung the skin and burned the eyes. The fumes rose sharply, but the promise of longer shelf life was too tempting to ignore. Once rinsed, the vegetables looked immaculate, as though freshly picked from green fields instead of scraped from grimy carts. Customers admired their brightness, their sharp crunch, their perfect preservation. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like washing lettuce in embalming fluid and calling it organic. The horror lies not in intent, but in ignorance. The taste of these foods was oddly clean, lacking the tang that true fermentation should have brought. The sourness of natural pickles had been replaced by a flat chemical flavour that numbed the tongue. Some noticed their throats felt raw after eating, or that their voices turned hoarse, but they blamed the chill of the air or the smoke of the streets. Children complained of burning sensations, their tongues swelling slightly, yet mothers simply told them to drink water and rest. Illness was a constant companion in city life. No one suspected it could come from something so ordinary as a cucumber. Doctors began recording strange symptoms among those who regularly ate street pickles: nausea, swollen tongues, and a lingering metallic taste. But formalin was new, and few understood its effects on the human body. Chemists had proven it could stop decay, so many assumed it must also prevent disease. The logic was tragically simple if it preserved. It must protect. It is unsettling how progress so easily blurs the line between cleanliness and contamination. Authorities knew about the use of formalin but rarely intervened. There were no clear laws against it, and enforcement meant admitting that the food of the poor was poison. As long as the market stayed orderly and no riots broke out, the government looked away. Inspectors visited only when scandals reached the newspapers, or when too many people fell ill at once. Even then, the reports were softened with polite language about improper handling and storage concerns. No one wanted to declare that the same chemical used in anatomy labs was now part of daily meals. For the sellers, the logic of survival left no room for conscience. Without preservatives, vegetables spoil within hours. The loss meant hunger, not just for customers but for their own families. Formalin was cheap, effective, and invisible. The choice was simple: use it or starve. They stirred it into barrels of water, dipped the produce, and sold it smiling. The sweet scent of preservation masked the slow poison within. I can picture the stalls lined along the river, the lamps flickering, reflecting off jars of pickles so clear they seem to glow. The air is thick with damp fog and the faint sting of chemicals. A vendor hands a paper cone filled with cabbage and carrots to a woman clutching her child. The vegetables shine under the light, their crispness almost too perfect. The woman takes a bite, nods approvingly, and pays without hesitation. The child eats too, the crunch echoing softly, both unaware that what keeps the food from dying will soon begin to harm the living. In homes, jars of preserved vegetables lined shelves beside bread and tea. They gave comfort during long winters, their colour bright against the gloom. Housewives prided themselves on keeping food that lasted, a sign of good management. When someone in the family fell ill with nausea or fever, it was blamed on fatigue or bad air. No one connected the sickness to the food that looked so pure. In a time when life was fragile, no one questioned miracles that promised endurance. The trade in preserved food expanded as the empire grew. Ships carried formalin-treated goods across colonies, feeding soldiers and workers alike. The poison spread silently, following the roots of progress. The very idea of freshness was redefined to last long was to be good, no matter how unnatural the method. The city had learned to equate longevity with safety, forgetting that death, too, does not rot once it is preserved. By the end of the century, reformers began speaking of the invisible dangers of modern food. They warned that cleanliness could hide as much filth as it erased. But for the poor, warnings meant little. They ate what they could afford, trusting the appearance of health. The jars continued to shine in the markets, the illusion of life carefully maintained through chemistry and need. The story of formalin pickles reveals how the fear of decay became more dangerous than decay itself. From the markets to the homes of the poor, freshness turned into a performance crafted by poison. Beyond those glowing jars, another cruelty brewed in kitchens, where mothers believed that sweetened milk and condensed cream could bring strength, but instead carried death to the unborn. In the narrow cellars beneath Victorian markets, where the air was damp and heavy with mould, blocks of cheese sat stacked like bricks of gold gone wrong. Their surfaces were cracked, discoloured, and alive with faint movement. For the merchants who dealt in them, this was not waste but opportunity. A bit of dye, a touch of scent, and rot could be turned back into profit. Green pigment covered the black spots, and a mist of vanilla oil masked the sourness. Once sliced and arranged behind glass, the cheese looked soft, rich, and fragrant. Customers saw luxury, not decay. It is almost laughable that the scent of sweetness could convince people that mould was flavour. Cheese was prized in Victorian diets as a food of substance. It kept longer than meat, filled the stomach, and added richness to the plain bread that most families relied on. But genuine fresh cheese was expensive. Aging rooms required ventilation and care, both rare in crowded cities. Instead, dealers bought spoiled or half-rotten wheels from rural farms at a fraction of the price. By the time these reached the markets, they were already infested with insects. Rather than discard them, sellers became alchemists of deception. They scraped the surfaces clean, cut away the worst patches, and rubbed the remainder with coloured wax. Under the dim gaslights, the illusion of freshness was complete. The smell in these markets was overwhelming, partly sour, partly sweet, a confusion of decay and perfume. Vendors called out their bargains, praising the nutty flavour and mature texture of their products. Shoppers smiled politely, trusting what they could not see. The cheese crumbled softly under the knife, releasing a faint, pleasant scent from the artificial flavouring. Beneath the surface, however, the heart of each wheel was hollow, eaten through by worms and time. When cut thin and served with bread, it looked harmless enough. People who ate it later found themselves doubled over in pain, but illness was so common that few questioned its source. In poorer homes, cheese was often the only source of protein. Mothers shaved off slices for their children, believing it to be nourishing. The flavour was strong, the smell comforting, and the price right. To them, it was a small indulgence, a mark of dignity and scarcity. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like seasoning spoiled food with perfume and calling it gourmet. The absurdity is hard to fathom now, but to the poor of Victorian England, this was simply survival. Doctors noticed recurring cases of stomach distress, vomiting, and fever, often following market days. They warned that cheese of improper character caused dangerous inflammation, yet without clear evidence, their warnings went ignored. There were no regulations to stop the trade, and even inspectors were reluctant to destroy valuable goods. The cheese sold quickly, moved from one market to the next, each wheel trimmed thinner and thinner until nothing remained but the polished rind. The process was industrial in its own way. Workers in small workshops brushed dyes over the surfaces, using pigments meant for textiles. Some added chalk or gypsum to restore firmness. Others dipped the blocks into wax mixed with green colour to imitate expensive varieties from abroad. When cracks appeared, they filled them with butter and pressed the shape again. The result was convincing enough to pass as fresh. Customers, desperate for affordable food, never thought to question it. It is unsettling how hunger turns deceit into a kind of honesty. Inside the body, the bacteria multiplied. Those who ate the cheese complained of cramps and chills. Some recovered after days of agony, others did not. Yet no one traced these deaths back to the market. In a city filled with smog and sewage, everything could cause sickness, so nothing was blamed. Even when worms were found in leftovers, people shrugged. Worms were part of life. At least they proved the food was once real. I can almost imagine a small kitchen lit by candlelight. A mother unwraps her purchase from brown paper, cutting the cheese into thin slices. The smell rises, sharp but pleasant. She places it on a plate beside bread and tea, calling her children to eat. Their faces brighten as they chew, the taste filling their mouths, warm and rich. She feels proud to have provided a real meal. Hours later, one of the children clutches his stomach, moaning softly. She blames the weather, or perhaps the milk, never the cheese that looked so fine. Merchants thrived on this quiet ignorance. Each week, they brought in more spoiled stock, treating it as though it were raw material to be refined. Profit came not from quality, but from transformation, from decay into deception. When reformers later demanded inspections, the sellers laughed. "Cheese always smells," they said. "How can one tell what is bad?" Their laughter carried the same tone as resignation, a truth too obvious to fight. The cycle continued, feeding cities that were already rotting from within. The rich bought imported cheese sealed in tins, while the poor consumed local versions that barely resembled food. The contrast mirrored the society itself, one half perfumed and polished, the other quietly dying beneath a layer of disguise. By the time authorities began to study the problem, the damage was already woven into daily life. The people had built an appetite for illusion and learned to find comfort in what should have disgusted them. The factories that eventually replaced these markets brought no real safety. They made the process faster, more efficient, and even more impersonal. Food became just another product, processed, perfumed, and sold to those too hungry to resist. The idea of mature flavour lingered, now refined into marketing slogans. The worms were gone, but the deception remained. The story of Victorian cheese reveals how decay can wear the mask of delicacy, how rot can be polished into elegance. From cellars to dinner tables, people consumed the illusion of richness and called it progress. Beyond those mouldy stalls, the next deception shimmered in the streets, where the golden glow of frying pans hid oil rendered from death itself. The smell of fried food drifted through every Victorian street, curling through the fog like an invitation. Children stopped on their way home from work, eyes fixed on the sizzling pans set out on corners. The stalls promised comfort, warmth, and flavour for a few cheap coins. At first glance, the golden piles of fried potatoes looked irresistible, crispy, glistening, and hot enough to steam in the cold air. But most of those pieces were not fresh at all. They were yesterday's leftovers, gathered from greasy trays and cold corners, mashed together and dyed bright yellow to look new again. It is almost comic how easily hunger turns waste into temptation. Vendors rarely threw anything away. Every scrap mattered. The fried potatoes that had broken apart or burned were not discarded but saved, pressed, and remade. Early each morning, stall owners gathered the remains, some scraped from the pavement, others pulled from the pans where oil had turned black overnight. The pieces were mashed with flour, mixed into a dough the colour of dirt, then dyed with powdered pigment to imitate the cheerful gold of freshly fried food. The mixture was rolled into thin cakes, dusted again with flour, and tossed into hot oil that had been used too many times to count. The smell was heavy and confusing, half sweet, half metallic. It clung to clothes and hair, sinking into the fog that never quite lifted from London streets. People did not notice, or they did not care. The fried cakes came out crisp on the outside, soft inside, and filled the air with a greasy richness that promised fullness more than flavour. Workers lined up at stalls, coins already damp in their palms, and children waited with open hands. For many, this was the only hot meal of the day. The oil itself was a poison that no one recognised. It was reused until it became thick and black, its surface covered with bits of ashen batter. Vendors filtered it through cloth at night and poured it back into pans the next morning. The bubbling heat masked the rot. The colour made everything look delicious. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like recycling food from garbage bins, colouring it gold, and calling it fast food. The thought feels grotesque, yet in the alleys of Victorian cities, it was routine. Women working long hours in factories were among the best customers. They bought the fried cakes on their way home, wrapped in scraps of newspaper, the oil soaking through the print. The warmth in their hands was worth the risk. Hunger dulled suspicion, and exhaustion silenced disgust. Some shared the food with their children, tearing it into pieces small enough for tiny mouths. The taste was comforting, the crunch familiar. The sickness that followed felt like a coincidence. Doctors described waves of stomach illness spreading through factory districts, calling them seasonal fevers. They spoke of contaminated water and bad air, never of fried food. The truth hid in plain sight, coated in grease and salt. The symptoms were always the same cramps, vomiting, dizziness, and fever. Some recovered quickly, others did not. Yet the stall stayed busy, the smell irresistible, the illusion too strong to break. It is disturbing how deeply people trusted the evidence of their senses when their senses had been trained by desperation. The sound of frying oil meant food, the shine of gold meant safety, and the warmth in the hand meant life. Few wanted to believe that the comfort they clung to could be killing them slowly. The vendors themselves were victims of the same system. They worked long hours beside the heat of their pans, their faces streaked with sweat and soot. The smoke stung their eyes, and their hands were covered in burns. Yet they smiled at their customers, calling out prices, praising the freshness of food that was anything but fresh. To them, survival mattered more than truth. They were part of a chain of hunger that began in the factories and ended in the stomachs of the poor. In the dim light of the market, everything looked the same shade of gold. Real potatoes and recycled paste fried side by side, indistinguishable once they left the pan. A clever vendor could stretch one day's waste into 2 days' profit. Children came back for seconds, giggling with greasy fingers, their laughter rising above the hiss of oil. No one asked where the food came from. No one wanted to know. At home, mothers placed the leftover cakes on plates beside bread and weak tea. Families ate together, grateful for warmth and fullness. They had long since stopped expecting food to be clean or pure. It only needed to quiet the hunger. The fatigue that followed was just part of life, a heaviness that no one questioned anymore. Even the smell of burnt oil felt like comfort. It meant dinner was ready. The government occasionally sent inspectors to test street food, but corruption ran deep. A bribe or a friendly handshake could turn any report clean. Newspapers wrote small pieces about unhygienic practices, but the outrage faded before the ink dried. The poor had no choice but to eat what they were given. To complain was to starve. I can picture the market at dusk, the stalls glowing like beacons in the grey fog. The noise of frying fills the air, mingling with the chatter of buyers. A woman in a worn shawl hands a few coins to the vendor, clutching a paper cone of fried cakes. Her daughter tugs at her sleeve, eager for a bite. They eat quickly, walking through the smoky streets, unaware that the same oil has been cooking death for days. The golden crumbs fall to the cobblestones, joining the dirt and ash below. By the end of the century, reformers tried again to enforce food safety laws. They spoke of cleaner oil, better oversight, and stricter inspections. But hunger did not wait for reform. The smell of frying continued to rise each evening, mingling with the scent of coal and sewage, feeding the city with comfort carved from decay. The story of reused fried potatoes reveals how poverty can turn scraps into illusions, feeding hope through the taste of ruin. From cold leftovers to burning oil, people swallowed the promise of warmth more than the food itself. Beneath the glow of those smoky stalls, another sweetness was already taking shape, a dessert so beautiful it shimmered like luxury, though it was built from rot and perfumed lies. In the polished halls of Victorian exhibitions, where chandeliers glittered and music drifted through the air, tables of free samples drew women in like bees to glass flowers. Among the displays of soaps, tonics, and sweets, the small bowls of colourful jelly stood out the most. They trembled gently under the light, their surfaces glossy and translucent, tinted in shades of pink, orange, and gold. Fruit of the future, the signs declared. Housewives admired their shimmer, tasting spoonfuls with delight. The texture was smooth, the flavour delicate, the price nothing at all. Few stopped to wonder what it was made of. It is strangely humorous that people celebrated progress by eating what was once scraped from slaughterhouse floors. The invention of gelatin-based desserts promised refinement. Until then, only the rich could afford jellies made from slow-boiled animal bones at home. Industrial processing changed everything. Factories now turned refuse, rotting hides, hooves, and bones into a glossy miracle. The waste of the meat industry was boiled, strained, bleached, and dried into sheets of powder. The smell, unbearable at first, was masked with industrial perfumes and dyes. What began as decay became a shimmering emblem of luxury. In the grand exhibition halls, manufacturers demonstrated the miracle of transformation. Visitors were told that nothing in the modern age went to waste. Even death could be refined into beauty. Cups of jelly were handed out by smiling attendants, their edges decorated with slices of fruit. Women tasted them, laughing softly, impressed by the elegance of progress. The irony was invisible. Each spoonful carried the memory of a carcass. When gelatin spread to homes, it became a symbol of sophistication. Recipes filled magazines, urging women to prepare moulded desserts shaped like crowns or flowers. Housewives prided themselves on their skill, never knowing that their kitchen treasures began in tanneries. The same vats used to treat leather now supplied gelatin. Chemicals such as alum, lime, and acid softened the hides, dissolving flesh into a paste that could later be flavoured and sold. Workers in these factories toiled in stench so strong it clung to their skin, yet the final product looked pure enough to serve at royal tables. Flavourings came from a different corner of the industry. Cheap synthetic perfumes meant for candles and soap, strawberry, peach, and orange were recreated from coal tar and industrial alcohol, their sweetness sharp enough to fool the tongue. The result was vivid and enticing, far more fragrant than anything nature could make. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like flavouring dessert with perfume and calling it gourmet cuisine. The perfection was artificial, but in a world built on appearances, that only made it more desirable. These jellies were offered to women as tokens of modern living. Advertisements promised they were light, healthy, and fashionable. Exhibitions distributed free samples to encourage new habits among middle-class housewives. Making them at home required only boiling water and patience, a miracle compared to the old labour of cooking. The convenience felt liberating, a taste of modern womanhood served in crystal moulds. No one thought about the labourers who scraped the hides or stirred the vats, or about the filth that fed this refinement. Progress had given decay a second life. It is unsettling how easily the boundary between innovation and corruption dissolves when comfort is involved. What mattered was not what food was made of, but how it looked on the table. Society had learned to equate beauty with virtue, and even a dessert made from waste could be considered elegant if it glistened brightly enough. In working-class neighbourhoods, cheaper versions of the dessert appeared in street stalls. The colours were harsher, the sweetness overwhelming, the texture rubbery. Vendors poured the jelly into tin cups or broken plates, letting children scoop pieces out with their fingers. They called it fruit delight, though no fruit had ever touched it. The same dyes used in textiles stained the children's tongues blue and red. They laughed, unaware that the treat they licked clean came from the same bones that once hung in slaughterhouse yards. Doctors began to see cases of stomach irritation and strange rashes, particularly among children. Some blamed the dyes, others the flavouring alcohols that remained in trace amounts. Yet no one called for reform. Compared to starvation and disease, a little discomfort seemed trivial. The jelly had become part of daily life, a symbol of modern abundance. It glittered too brightly to question. I can picture the scene of a mother proudly placing a moulded jelly on her dining table, the lamplight catching its smooth surface. Her children gather round, eyes wide, as she cuts it into slices that wobble delicately on their plates. She smiles, believing she's serving progress itself, a meal born of science, not hardship. The air smells faintly of sweetness and something else, something chemical that no one can quite name. The advertisements continue to bloom across newspapers, promising elegance and purity. The manufacturers built reputations on innovation, never on honesty. Behind every spoonful of jelly lay the logic of an age that believed waste could be turned into wealth and poison into progress. As long as the dessert sparkled, no one cared where it came from. By the end of the century, gelatin had spread through every level of society. It appeared in banquet halls, school lunches, and hospital trays. The empire had found a way to consume its own refuse and call it refinement. No one questioned what it meant for food to be both beautiful and dead. The story of gelatin desserts reveals how easily glamour grows from decay, how industry feeds on its own waste and sells it as elegance. From slaughterhouse scraps to glittering tables, the illusion of sweetness masked the scent of death. Beneath those trembling confections, another deception waited, a liquid so pure it sparkled, hiding poison that sparkled brighter still. The dream of progress was everywhere in Victorian life. Newspapers praised the miracles of industry, preachers spoke of cleanliness as holiness, and the government called every invention a gift from modernity. Food was no exception. Factories turned out endless tins, powders, and sweets, all wrapped in labels that promised purity and civilization. Women, especially, were told that embracing these new products was their duty. To cook with them was to serve the empire. To resist them was to remain backward. Each meal became a quiet performance of loyalty to progress. It is grimly amusing that the very foods advertised as signs of enlightenment were slowly extinguishing those who believed in them most. Victorian society saw women as guardians of morality, health, and domestic virtue. Yet they were also the easiest to control through ideals of modern living. Advertisements and sermons told them what to eat, how to serve it, and what it meant to be a proper mother. Clean, white, and efficient became the holy trinity of modern food. The old ways, farm butter, home-churned cream, dark bread, were labelled dirty and primitive. In their place came polished sugar, bleached flour, and canned meat, all praised as blessings of science. To question these blessings was to question civilization itself. Factories and shops reinforced the message. Window displays showed rows of shining tins, stacks of snowy loaves, and piles of candy wrapped in coloured paper. The colours dazzled, the scents seemed pure, and the prices invited everyone to join the modern feast. For women trapped between expectation and poverty, these goods offered pride. They could feed their families cheaply and still feel refined. Few realised that what they bought for safety carried hidden poisons. Government officials did not intervene. The state's pride in industrial progress outweighed concern for public health. To admit that food was killing people would have meant admitting that the empire's success was built on decay. Instead, officials called poisonings accidents or acts of nature. When entire districts fell ill after consuming cheap bread or sweets, reports were softened, numbers adjusted, and blame placed on ignorance rather than corruption. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like governments calling toxic chemicals a healthy diet just because they boost the economy. The absurdity of it was buried under layers of patriotism and progress. The church joined in, preaching that cleanliness and modernity were signs of divine favour. Ministers spoke against the filth of old-fashioned living and praised the order of factory-made goods. They told women that by buying processed foods, they were honouring God through civilization. Faith and consumption became intertwined, and morality was measured by appearance. Even death could not break the illusion. When women died of food poisoning, their funerals were described as the natural will of heaven. Few questioned how heaven could have been packaged and sold in a tin. It is horrifying how easily virtue can be weaponized to disguise greed. The women who followed these rules most faithfully were the ones who suffered most. They obeyed, they trusted, and they paid with their health. The very purity they chased became their undoing. They were not poisoned by rebellion or indulgence, but by obedience. Doctors saw the patterns but spoke cautiously. Many depended on the same industries for their livelihoods. Some even endorsed products publicly, calling them nutritious innovations. Others blamed the victims, suggesting that poor hygiene or weak constitutions were to blame. The truth that the empire's food supply was laced with chemicals remained unspeakable in polite society. The few reformers who tried to expose it were dismissed as alarmists, accused of standing against progress. In middle-class homes, the cycle of trust continued. Housewives filled their cupboards with tins and jars, confident in their safety. They prepared meals that sparkled under gaslight, bright sauces, polished meats, and colourful desserts. The family dined proudly, believing themselves modern and civilized. The next day, someone would fall ill, and the doctor would call it fatigue. The connection between beauty and poison was invisible because it was too painful to see. In poorer homes, the story was crueler. Cheap imitations of these same foods flooded the markets, flour cut with chalk, milk stretched with water, butter replaced with wax. Women bought them anyway, drawn by the idea of progress that others had sold them. They wanted to feed their families something respectable, something modern. Their children grew sickly, their own bodies weakened, but they kept believing. Progress had become a religion stronger than truth. I can almost imagine a narrow kitchen where a woman carefully sets out her dinner: a loaf of white bread, a bit of butter, a slice of cheese that gleams unnaturally bright. She straightens the tablecloth, proud of its cleanliness. Her husband smiles, her children eat eagerly, and for a moment she feels she has done everything right. The next morning, her youngest cannot rise from bed. The doctor arrives, shakes his head, and calls it a weak heart. Her grief is quiet, her guilt misplaced. The tin, the bread, the butter, all remain untouched on the shelf, waiting for the next meal. The empire recorded no scandal. There were no statistics for these deaths, no monuments for these women. Their stories dissolved into domestic silence, buried under the weight of routine. The world praised their discipline, their cleanliness, their faith in modern living, and they continue to die by the thousands, their names unspoken, their suffering written off as destiny. By the time reform finally began to stir, the habit of blind trust was already too deep. Industry adapted faster than conscience, changing its formulas but not its philosophy. Progress still demanded sacrifice. It simply learned to smile while asking for it. The story of these obedient deaths reveals how easily progress can turn compassion into cruelty. From government halls to church pulpits, the call to eat modern became a hymn of poison. Beneath that chorus of faith and pride, another silence grew, one that began not in homes or markets, but in the very heart of the river that carried the city's waste and fed it back to its people. The sound of fizzing bottles became the heartbeat of Victorian summers. On street corners, men with pushcarts clinked glass against glass, pouring bright liquids into tumblers for eager crowds. The drink sparkled in the sunlight, colours shifting from lemon yellow to blood orange, promising refreshment after long hours of work. Soda water was new, modern, and full of wonder. It hissed and bubbled like captured lightning, sold as both medicine and luxury. The labels boasted pure water and scientific flavour, words that carried weight in an age obsessed with progress. Yet inside those shining bottles was not purity but poison. It is almost comical that Victorians trusted chemistry more than their own thirst. The foundation of these drinks was not fresh water from springs, but tap water from the city pipes. Those pipes ran through filth, leaking rust and sewage into every flow. To mask the taste, vendors mixed in crude sugar and essence powders that smelled of citrus but tasted of metal. Then came the preservatives, borax to hold the flavour, sulfate salts to sharpen the tongue, and chalk to brighten the liquid. Together, they gave the illusion of crispness. The more artificial the drink, the cleaner it appeared. People believed they were drinking progress itself. Soda was a symbol of health and modernity. Doctors prescribed it for digestion. Mothers gave it to children on hot days, and workers bought it to wash the soot from their throats. The bubbling sound was comforting, the sharp sting on the tongue refreshing. But the miracle came at a cost. Borax and sulfate salts were not meant for the body. They strained the kidneys, scarred the liver, and slowly poisoned those who drank them daily. The damage crept in quietly, hidden beneath the glamour of modern refreshment. Vendors understood the power of spectacle. They decorated their carts with glass jars filled with coloured syrup, ribbons tied around their bottles, and signs painted with phrases like "pure as crystal." The sight of bubbles rising through clear glass was hypnotic. Children crowded around, their faces glowing in the reflection. Each bottle opened with a pop-like applause, a small promise of joy for a penny. No one could resist the thrill of the sound. It felt alive, even if the drink inside was not. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like bottling industrial cleaner, adding sugar, and selling it as wellness water. The absurdity of it barely registered in a world that believed science could perfect everything. For Victorians, a drink that sparkled must surely be good. Factories that made these sodas were loud and hot, filled with steam and chemical fumes. Workers poured powders into vats of water that hissed and frothed violently. The floors were slick with syrup, the air thick with the sting of acid. Men and women toiled among barrels marked borax, sulfate, and essence of lemon. They coughed constantly, their eyes watering from the fumes, but the pay was steady and the demand endless. Bottles rolled down conveyor belts, sealed with corks, and packed into crates that travelled to every corner of the empire. In homes, the drinks were treasured. Families poured them into glasses at dinner, toasting to good health. Mothers mixed soda with milk for children, believing it made the body strong. When illness came, nausea, fever, swollen joints, few blamed the colourful bottles on the shelf. Doctors prescribed tonics that contained the same ingredients, calling them stomach purifiers. The poisons of the age reinforced one another, disguised by bubbles and optimism. It is horrifying how easily pleasure can disguise destruction when it arrives in a beautiful form. The taste of soda became addictive. The sharp sweetness cut through the bitterness of daily life, giving brief relief from the heat and hunger. Even when people knew it made them sick, they returned to it. It was one of the few affordable luxuries that felt civilized. The empire's dream of refinement had found its simplest expression in a glass of poison that sparkled like sunlight. Inspectors occasionally tested samples from soda factories and found alarming levels of chemicals. Reports listed cases of kidney failure, jaundice, and chronic fatigue among regular consumers. Yet nothing changed. The manufacturers argued that their products were safe in small amounts, and the government preferred not to interfere with a booming trade. Newspapers published glowing articles about the soda miracle, celebrating it as proof that Britain led the world in modern science. No one wanted to hear that progress was dissolving slowly into people's bloodstreams. In the poorer districts, the drinks became even cheaper and deadlier. Vendors watered them down with whatever liquid they could find, sometimes river water, sometimes waste from breweries. The colours grew brighter, the flavours harsher, the danger invisible. Children drank them by the pint, the fizz burning their throats. To them, the bubbling liquid felt alive, a rare form of joy. They did not know it was slowly killing them. I can almost picture the scene: a crowded street in summer, the air thick with coal smoke and laughter. A man wipes his brow and drinks from a glass bottle, the soda sparkling under the sun. He sighs with relief, hands the bottle to his son, who drinks too, smiling. The moment feels perfect, ordinary, human. Yet beneath that brief comfort, their bodies begin the slow work of decay. When sickness spread through the factories and neighbourhoods, it was called exhaustion or heat stroke. No one connected it to the glowing bottles lined neatly in shops. The empire had turned its citizens into customers of their own decline. To the authorities, as long as trade prospered, the human cost remained invisible. By the end of the century, advertisements grew even grander. Posters showed women in white dresses holding glasses of soda, their smiles serene. Purity had become a colour, a sound, a brand. The hiss of gas escaping a bottle was the anthem of progress, the noise of civilization quenching its own thirst with death. The story of Victorian soda reveals how beauty and danger can share the same sparkle. From the factory floor to the family table, progress bubbled in every glass, feeding illusion more than thirst. Within that glittering surface, another kind of sweetness was rising, soft, fragrant, and deadly. A dessert that shimmered like innocence while rotting the soul of an empire. The Victorians adored colour. In parlours and dining rooms across the empire, every plate seemed to shimmer with shades of pink, cream, and gold. Dessert, especially, was a spectacle of beauty meant to impress guests and prove refinement. On special evenings, tables gleamed with bowls of pastel pudding and silver trays of ice cream that steamed faintly in the gaslight. The dishes looked perfect, smooth, cold, and sweet. But their elegance was built on deception. The pink pudding that glowed like roses was made from plaster dust, and the ice cream that melted on the tongue began its life beside death. It is both absurd and tragic that refinement could be sculpted from rot and stone. The pride of every hostess was the pudding. Its rosy tint was a mark of success, a symbol of wealth and taste. Yet that colour did not come from fruit. It came from powdered gypsum, the same substance used to coat walls, mixed with a dye called carmine made by crushing thousands of tiny red insects. The mixture thickened easily and held its shape well, turning even spoiled milk into something that looked luxurious. Served with cream or syrup, it seemed delicate and light, but each spoonful carried fine particles that scraped the throat and irritated the stomach. Guests praised its smoothness, unaware that they were swallowing dust meant for construction. The ice cream, too, was an illusion of purity. True cream and clean ice were expensive, so vendors used cheaper versions. Milk that had begun to sour was boiled and mixed with heavy sugar to disguise its flavour. The ice came from dubious places, collected from dirty ponds or chipped from blocks stored near morgues and butcher stalls. The same carts that carried meat and bodies carried ice as well. The chill hid the stench, the cold made decay forgettable. Women loved the taste of frozen sweetness, the cool relief after heavy dinners, and the novelty of holding something so refined. They did not know that each bite carried the residue of death's breath. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like freezing spoiled milk with graveyard snow and selling it as a luxury dessert. The thought is grotesque, but for Victorians, it was progress. Industrial cooking had made delicacy accessible, and few cared to ask how the miracle was achieved. In factories, the process was mechanical and merciless. Workers mixed plaster, sugar, and dye in giant vats, their hands raw from stirring the gritty paste. The smell of decay filled the air as sour milk was poured into the blend. When the mixture set, it gleamed faintly pink, like marble polished for display. The cakes were wrapped in paper printed with elegant names: Strawberry Delight, Queen's Cream, Peach Pudding, Inside Homes. Women unwrapped them with pride, mixing the powder with water or milk and serving it in crystal bowls. The deception was as complete as it was deadly. Children especially adored these treats. The sweetness was overwhelming, the colours too bright to resist. They laughed as their tongues turned red, unaware that the dye that painted them came from insects and metal salts. Afterward, many complained of burning mouths or swelling lips, but their mothers waved it away. Perhaps it was the sugar, the heat. Illness was always nearby in the city, and dessert seemed too innocent to blame. It is unsettling how beauty was allowed to wound as long as it glittered. The empire's obsession with elegance had infected its food, turning nourishment into spectacle. A proper woman was expected to serve perfection, even if perfection was poison. The closer something looked to luxury, the more dangerous it became. Reports began to surface in medical journals. Doctors wrote of rashes, throat swelling, and sudden fevers following dessert parties. Some suspected contamination, others thought it was hysteria. Few connected these symptoms to the puddings and ice creams everyone adored. There were no regulations, no tests, and no accountability. The factories changed their dyes when scandals broke, then changed back when the public forgot. The cycle of sickness continued quietly, as it had with every other beautiful poison of the age. The upper classes were not spared. Their banquets featured ice cream sculpted into swans and roses, glowing under chandeliers. Servants carved them at the table, their knives cutting through layers of frozen milk and plaster. Guests gasped at the beauty, unaware that the cold sweetness scraping their tongues carried the same dust that lined their ceilings. In that silence of admiration, no one asked why beauty so often came with pain. In the poorer districts, the same desserts appeared in simpler forms: small cups of pink jelly sold for pennies. Street vendors shouted promises of real fruit flavour, though none could afford fruit at all. The bright pink caught every eye. Children tugged at their mothers' skirts, begging for a taste. The women gave in, knowing it was safer than hunger, or so they believed. I can almost see the market at dusk, the air heavy with heat. A girl in a faded dress holds a small cup of pink pudding, the colour too vivid to be real. She eats slowly, smiling, the sweetness coating her tongue. Her mother watches with quiet pride, thinking she has given her daughter a rare treat. Hours later, the child will wake crying, her lips swollen, her breath shallow. The dessert will still gleam untouched in the bowl, perfect and poisonous. By the end of the century, plaster-based puddings and insect-dyed sweets were so common that few noticed them anymore. They became part of the landscape of comfort, proof that even waste could be refined into luxury. Reformers tried to warn the public, but the charm of colour and convenience proved stronger than reason. Beauty was addictive, and the empire had no desire to let it go. The story of these poisonous desserts reveals how deeply deception was baked into the taste of progress. From kitchen tables to grand banquets, sweetness became a silent test of faith in modernity. Within that illusion of purity, the people of the empire learned to mistake sickness for sophistication, a confusion that would soon spread beyond food itself, to medicine, to comfort, to every promise wrapped in the name of civilization. The Victorian appetite for appearances did not stop at sweets or bread. It extended deep into the baskets of vegetables, into the piles of mushrooms that filled the morning markets with their pale promise. Mushrooms were prized then as food for the refined, a touch of nature brought to the city table. The white ones were considered pure, gentle, and luxurious, while dark or spotted mushrooms were shunned as unclean. This obsession with whiteness created opportunity. In back rooms behind stalls, sellers soaked discoloured mushrooms in washing chemicals until their skins gleamed like porcelain. The sight was convincing. The danger was invisible. It is disturbingly ironic that the same substance used to clean laundry was trusted to clean food. The process began simply. Mushrooms collected from damp forests arrived grey, bruised, or blackened from the journey. The colour alone could ruin their price, no matter how fresh they were. To restore their market value, sellers turned to what they knew: bleaching powder, borrowed from laundries and tanneries. Soaked briefly in the solution, the mushrooms shed their stains. The chemical smell faded after drying, replaced by the earthy scent of the market. To the untrained eye, they looked newly picked. Housewives admired the colour and paid extra for what they believed was cleanliness itself. The deception spread quickly. Whiter mushrooms fetched higher prices, and traders learned to imitate the trick. Whole crates were bleached at once, dried in smoky rooms, and sold under names like Fine Forest Select or Pure Table Quality. The idea of clean food had taken hold so completely that people forgot what natural mushrooms looked like. Their greyness, their rough edges, their imperfections were replaced by pale, sterile uniformity, and with every meal, the illusion deepened. If one compares this to modern times, it would be like bleaching fruit with detergent and selling it as organic. The thought feels absurd, but in an age that equated brightness with purity, it made perfect sense. To the Victorians, colour was morality, and whiteness meant virtue. The mushroom, stripped of its natural hue, became a moral object, good, proper, and deadly. Inside the body, the chemicals began their slow work. They burned the stomach lining, scarred the liver, and weakened the kidneys. People who ate these mushrooms often complained of fatigue, headaches, or yellowed eyes. Doctors attributed it to bad air or overwork, never suspecting that dinner itself was the cause. The poison moved too quietly for anyone to notice. Only when symptoms turned fatal did anyone think to ask questions, and by then, the trail had vanished into empty plates and untraceable markets. The poor were most at risk. For them, mushrooms were an affordable luxury, something that felt elegant without costing much. Vendors sold small bundles tied with a string, calling them forest gifts. Housewives carried them home proudly, believing they were bringing health to their families. The idea of danger was unthinkable. Mushrooms were natural, and nature was supposed to be safe. In truth, nature had been scrubbed, boiled, and drowned in the very chemicals used to whiten linen. In restaurants and upper-class kitchens, the same false purity reigned. Chefs preferred the whitened mushrooms because they looked refined on porcelain plates. When guests cut into them, their texture was soft, their colour unblemished, their flavour slightly bitter, interpreted as delicate. The faint aftertaste of chemicals was masked by butter and wine. Praise was abundant. In their pursuit of visual perfection, no one realised that each bite brought them closer to slow poisoning. It is grotesque how the pursuit of beauty can erase the line between food and toxin. The Victorians prided themselves on control over nature, over the body, over society. But control often meant altering what was real until only appearance remained. In the case of mushrooms, the empire's vanity found its purest metaphor to be good was to look white, no matter what it cost inside. The factories that produced bleaching agents profited from this deception. Chemical waste from laundries and tanneries was sold cheaply to vendors who used it for food preparation. No law forbade it, no inspector cared to ask. To the authorities, the poor who bought cheap food were responsible for their own suffering. Markets continued to hum, mushrooms continued to shine, and illness continued to grow in the shadows. I can almost picture the scene in an early morning market. The air is damp, filled with smoke from carts and the faint tang of chemicals. A woman lifts a handful of pale mushrooms, her eyes lighting up at their whiteness. She smiles as she pays, her fingers brushing the powdery surface. Later, in her kitchen, the mushrooms hiss in the pan, releasing a faint bitter scent beneath the butter. Her children eat eagerly, their faces bright in the glow of the lamp. Somewhere beneath that comfort, the poison begins its patient work. Newspapers occasionally mentioned strange fevers or market illnesses, but no one traced them to the humble mushroom. The danger had become ordinary, buried beneath the illusion of cleanliness. In a culture that valued appearance over truth, whiteness became both shield and weapon. The empire's obsession with purity had turned its food into a laboratory, its citizens into experiments. By the time reformers tried to address the issue, it was too late. The habit of trusting appearances was too deeply ingrained. People had learned to believe what they saw, even when what they saw was false. Beauty, cleanliness, and death shared a single colour, white. The story of these bleached mushrooms reveals how a society blinded by its own ideals can mistake poison for progress. From market stalls to grand tables, the chase for purity consumed reason itself. Inside that illusion of safety, something darker was already brewing, a secret so ordinary and so accepted that it would soon find its way into milk, the very symbol of innocence. The pursuit of perfection never stopped at whitened mushrooms. The Victorian hunger for purity went further, into the kitchens and bakeries that filled the air with the smell of sugar and grease. In those places, the need for beauty overcame reason. Baked goods were meant to look flawless, golden on the outside and crisp to the bite. Housewives prided themselves on biscuits that crumbled delicately between the teeth, and doughnuts that stayed fresh for days. The secret behind this perfection was not skill, nor quality, but chemistry. Powdered bleach, the same kind used to scrub floors and toilets, became a common ingredient. Bakers mixed it into flour or frying oil to keep pastries firm and bright, calling it improver powder. It whitened the dough, it made the crust crackle, and it killed bacteria, at least in theory. No one questioned how something that could burn skin might also make food better. It is disturbingly funny that cleanliness in the Victorian kitchen was achieved by serving disinfectant for dessert. These powders were cheap and effective. The factories that produced cleaning agents sold their waste to bakers at a fraction of the cost of flour. It was a trade that suited everyone. The manufacturers avoided disposal costs, the bakers saved money, and the customers got the illusion of quality. A golden biscuit that snapped perfectly in half seemed modern, scientific, and pure. The problem was that purity came at a cost the human body could not pay. The bleach corroded the mouth and stomach lining, leaving tiny burns that became ulcers. Over time, the poison reached deeper organs. Those who ate these treats regularly developed chronic pain, nausea, and eventually internal bleeding. Still, few connected their sickness to the food. In a world already full of smoke and soot, illness was simply part of life. No one expected safety from the streets, the air, or the water. Why expect it from a bakery doctors attributed symptoms to weakness, bad digestion, or female nerves? When someone died, the cause was written as exhaustion or natural decline. There were no food laws to investigate, no agencies to blame. A baker who killed half a neighbourhood could open again a week later under a new name. If we compare it to today, it would be like adding bathroom cleaner to pastry dough and calling it an innovation in hygiene. The thought sounds absurd, but to Victorians it fit perfectly with their faith in industrial progress. They believed that science could refine everything: taste, texture, and even morality. To eat the products of chemistry was to participate in civilization. What could be more modern than food that never spoiled and shone like porcelain inside the bakeries? The work was relentless. Women and children laboured in rooms filled with flour dust that stung their eyes and throats. When the bleaching powder was added, the air turned sharp and metallic. The workers coughed until their chests ached, yet they kept kneading, their fingers raw and white from contact with the chemicals. The pastries that emerged from their ovens gleamed golden and perfect. Customers lined up outside, eager for something that looked clean in a dirty world. Street stalls sold fried sweets by the dozen, donuts, biscuits, fritters, all made with the same chemical touch. The oil shimmered in the pan, carrying the faint smell of detergent. Children crowded around, coins clutched in their hands. They ate eagerly, unaware that every crisp bite was coated with poison. By nightfall, many would complain of burning throats or stomach cramps. Their mothers would blame the cold air or bad luck. For most, the connection between food and harm simply did not exist. It is strange how easily trust becomes habit, and habit becomes blindness. People learned to ignore discomfort because questioning it meant facing something worse, the possibility that survival itself was dangerous. They lived in a city where every promise of comfort carried a hidden threat. Food was supposed to be a pleasure, yet it became another test of endurance. Newspapers occasionally mentioned mysterious deaths. One report told of a woman who collapsed after eating sugared donuts from a street vendor. Her insides were said to be burned as though by fire. The story drew brief attention, then faded. No names were printed, no bans were issued. There was always another headline waiting. In the grand machinery of the empire, individual suffering disappeared quickly. Progress did not pause for autopsies. Bakers defended their practices. They claimed the powders were harmless if used correctly, insisting they kept food fresh and prevented disease. Some even cited laboratory experiments that supported them. Experiments, of course, funded by the very factories that sold the chemicals. The public preferred reassurance to truth. It was easier to believe that science was on their side than to admit that they were being slowly poisoned by it. In middle-class homes, women proudly displayed tins of these ready-made biscuits. They were convenient, tidy, and respectable. Guests admired their colour and crunch. No one noticed the faint bitterness that lingered on the tongue. It was a taste people grew used to, as they had grown used to the smoke in the air and the dirt in the water. Civilization, it seemed, always had an aftertaste. In the poorer neighbourhoods, street bakers reused old oil mixed with cleaning powder to keep it from spoiling. The stench was strong, but customers did not care. Hunger made the senses forgiving. The vendors smiled and called it modern frying. For a few pennies, they offered a taste of progress, crispy, golden, and fatal. I imagine one of those vendors standing by his stall, the pan bubbling as he flips a row of donuts. A woman in a threadbare shawl buys one for her child, who bites eagerly, smiling through sugar dust. The sweetness fades quickly, replaced by a sharp burn at the back of his throat. The mother laughs softly, thinking he has eaten too fast. The next morning, she will find him weak and feverish. She will never know why. The empire's pride in cleanliness became its own undoing. The same chemicals that whitened clothes, polished walls, and scrubbed floors found their way into food, welcomed as signs of progress. The obsession with purity blinded an entire society to its decay. In the end, they did not die from hunger or war, but from the very modernity they worshipped. The story of these poisoned pastries shows how refinement can turn monstrous when detached from humanity. What Victorians called purity was only control disguised as virtue, and as the scent of bleach faded from the bakeries, another invention was already waiting, something sweeter, cheaper, and far deadlier, promising the comfort of milk and sugar but carrying the taste of death beneath the cream. Victorian schools were proud of their orderliness. Rows of children in stiff uniforms sat behind wooden tables, hands folded, waiting for the sound of the meal bell. For many, the midday meal provided by charitable organisations or city programmes was the only food they would eat that day. It was meant to represent care, progress, and the empire's moral duty toward the poor. The bowls looked clean, the portions fair, and the teachers praised the generosity of the donors. But behind the closed kitchen doors, charity had a bitter aftertaste. What filled those bowls was not kindness, but waste. The bread was stale, the porridge sour, and the sweets came from the leftovers of restaurants and bakeries. Food that would have been thrown away for paying customers was recycled into nutritious meals for schoolchildren. It is bleakly amusing that Victorian society could turn garbage into virtue simply by feeding it to the poor. The system was efficient. Hotels, inns, and large houses sold their unwanted food at low prices to middlemen, who cooked it again, scraped off mould, or covered decay with sugar or spice. From there, the food was sent to schools under the label of economical supplies. Inspectors rarely visited, and when they did, they cared only about quantity, not quality. A kitchen that served 50 bowls instead of 30 was praised, even if the contents were foul. Teachers were told to be grateful. In reports to city boards, the meals were described as wholesome and sufficient for the lower classes. No one asked how they smelled, how they looked, or what they did to the bodies of the children who ate them. The food itself was a cruel disguise. Porridge made from old oats clumped into grey lumps, its sourness hidden under cheap treacle. Biscuits were ground from returned bread, mixed with fat scraped off kitchen pans. Candy was boiled from sugar runoff, the residue left in industrial barrels. Some cooks soaked spoiled meat in vinegar to mask the smell, calling it preserved protein. The children swallowed it because hunger is stronger than disgust. They had no choice but to eat quickly, before the bell rang again. If we compare it to modern times, it would be like serving children reheated fast food scraped from bins and calling it nutrition. The horror lies not only in the act, but in how normal it became. Society congratulated itself for teaching discipline and thrift, while poisoning the weakest in its care. The meals were obedience lessons as much as survival. Children learned early that gratitude mattered more than comfort, that to complain was ungrateful, and that bad taste was better than an empty stomach. Girls often suffered the most. They were given smaller portions, expected to eat quietly, and scolded if they hesitated. Many fell sick soon after, their bodies too fragile to digest the rancid fat and spoiled milk. Fever and diarrhea spread through dormitories, blamed on seasonal illness. A few never recovered, their deaths recorded as natural misfortune. Parents were told that the schools had done their best, and in a sense, they had, by the standards of an empire that measured compassion in pennies. There is something deeply unsettling about how efficiently cruelty can hide behind good intentions. To the administrators, feeding the poor was a moral act. Whether the food killed them was irrelevant. In a world obsessed with appearances, virtue mattered more than consequence. As long as the records looked good, the suffering stayed invisible. Inside the kitchens, the workers moved fast. Women stirred large pots of grey stew, the smell of vinegar and rot thick in the air. They wore aprons blackened from smoke and grease, stirring with wooden spoons that had absorbed the stench of decay. Sometimes rats fell into the pots, or insects floated on the surface. The cook simply skimmed them off and kept serving. They earned little, and to refuse work was to go hungry themselves. The sound of coughing children outside was just another part of the routine. The dining rooms were crowded, noisy, and dim. Bowls clattered against the tables, spoons scraped, and a faint steam rose from the food. The smell was a mix of sour milk and damp wood. Some children ate slowly, others hurried, fearing that a teacher might see their hesitation. The older ones had learned to hold their noses, swallow quickly, and drink water afterward to dull the taste. They did not know what poison was, but they knew what it felt like. Their stomachs burned, their heads swam, and yet they kept eating. Reports occasionally surfaced in local papers about outbreaks of illness in schools. Entire classes were said to have fallen sick after lunch. The officials promised an investigation, but nothing changed. The supplier simply switched routes or names, and the food continued to flow. The empire prided itself on its efficiency, and this was efficiency in its purest form, turning waste into nourishment, death into duty. It was not only the food that was rotten, but the philosophy behind it. The poor were seen as tools of labour, their lives expendable as long as the machines kept running. Feeding them scraps was considered better than letting them starve. There was no empathy, only calculation. A full stomach, even if poisoned, was a sign of order. Civilization meant feeding everyone something, even if that something came from the gutter. I imagine one of those classrooms on a grey winter day. Frost creeps along the windows, and the smell of the meal seeps through the cracks. A teacher ladles thick porridge into bowls, smiling proudly at the portion size. A small girl takes her first bite, grimaces, then forces herself to swallow. The warmth spreads down her throat, but so does the bitterness. Hours later, she will lie in her dormitory bed, shivering with fever. Outside, the snow falls quietly, and no one comes to check on her. The city lights glow beyond the windows, indifferent and bright. The charities would later claim success. They had fed thousands. After all, the statistics looked clean. The empire congratulated itself on its benevolence. Progress was measured not by the lives saved, but by the meals served. In their reports, no one mentioned the smell of mould, the colour of the stew, or the graves of the children who had eaten it. The story of the school meals exposes how mercy can rot when touched by greed. The empire's generosity was built on leftovers, its compassion flavoured with decay. And while the bowls emptied each day, another hunger was growing quietly, one that craved not food, but truth, and the courage to face what their civilization had truly become. In the crowded markets of Victorian cities, the smell of cooked meat was a luxury few could afford to resist. The stalls that sold beef balls or nutritive meat patties were among the most popular. For working women who laboured long hours in factories or laundries, the sight of those brownish-red lumps sizzling in pans promised strength and recovery. They were cheap, easy to cook, and carried the comforting illusion of nourishment. Sellers claimed the meat was rich in iron, good for the blood, and ideal for women who were often faint or weak from hunger. But the truth inside those neat little balls was far less generous. The mixture was made not from beef muscle, but from what the butcher could not sell: organs, dried blood, and crushed bone fragments. The scraps were ground together, perfumed with artificial beef essence, and dyed a reddish brown to look fresh. It is grimly ironic that what Victorians called food for vitality was made from the very refuse of death. The recipe was a triumph of economy. Nothing was wasted. The slaughterhouses on the edge of the city sent their leftover organs, congealed blood, and broken bones to workshops where men with stained aprons worked beside vats of steam. There, the refuse was boiled down until the liquid turned thick and black. The residue was pressed into moulds, cooled, and sold to vendors as base meat. All it needed was a little spice and colour. The powders that made it look appetizing came from the same dye houses that tinted fabrics for dresses and curtains. When the mixture was fried, the dyes bled into the fat, releasing a smell both sweet and sour. Customers mistook it for richness. In truth, it was rot disguised as sustenance. For the poor, this counterfeit meat filled a deep need. Protein was scarce, and meat prices were high. Families of 6 might share one small cut of real beef in a week. The meatballs, however, were within reach. 2 pennies could buy enough to fill a pot of soup. Women brought them home wrapped in paper, proud of their thrift. They believed the meat's dark colour meant it was strong. Some even thought it cured weakness or anemia. Doctors, when consulted, often reinforced these myths, telling women to eat more animal matter. They did not ask where that matter came from. If one compares it to today, it would be like grinding hospital waste into hamburger patties and marketing them as health food. The thought feels unthinkable now, but in the smog of the 19th century it was simply business. The lines between nourishment and decay had blurred. What mattered was appearance. The meat looked hearty, smelled savoury, and filled the stomach, even if it emptied life in return. Inside the workshops, conditions were horrifying. The floors were slick with old blood, the air thick with heat and the buzz of flies. Workers stirred vats of organs until the steam stuck to their skin like glue. Rats scurried across the rafters, feeding on the scraps. Buckets of dried blood were stored beside piles of bones waiting to be crushed. Every step was an assault on the senses, but to those employed there, it was work like any other. They were paid by the pound, not by conscience. In the markets, the deception was complete. The finished meatballs gleamed under the weak daylight, stacked in neat pyramids on tin trays. Vendors cut one open to reveal the reddish centre, proof of freshness. They shouted about their nourishing power, offering samples fried in rancid oil. Customers tasted the salt, the fat, and the spice, and that was enough. Hunger dulled suspicion. Mothers bought them for their children, factory girls ate them on their way home, and men took them in bread rolls to work. Each bite carried the illusion of strength, and each bite carried bacteria that multiplied inside the body. Illness followed quietly. Stomach pain, fever, and vomiting became so common that few connected them to the meat. People called it market fever, as if the air itself were to blame. Some victims recovered, others did not. Entire households fell sick after a single meal. Doctors wrote of mysterious gastric attacks that struck the poor but spared the rich. They never thought to look inside the street vendors' pans. It is unsettling how suffering can become invisible once it is shared by too many. In a society that accepted disease as routine, even mass poisoning lost its urgency. The empire prided itself on progress, yet its cities were filled with slow decay dressed up as advancement. Every industrial innovation seemed to carry a hidden cost, and the poor were always the ones to pay it. There were no regulations to protect them. The idea of inspecting food for safety was seen as an interference with trade. Parliament debated whether the poor deserved protection from their own choices. To legislate against bad meat, one member argued, was to insult the wisdom of the consumer. And so the trade continued, even when reporters exposed the factories that produced the so-called beef balls. The public's outrage faded within weeks. The cheapness of the product outweighed the danger it posed. In the kitchens of tenement houses, women turned the meatballs into soups and stews that simmered for hours. The smell was strong enough to mask its origin. Children dipped their bread into the broth, unaware that it carried bacteria waiting to bloom inside their bodies. The women believed they were caring for their families, feeding them warmth and strength after long hours of labour. When sickness came, they blamed fate or exhaustion, never the meal that had seemed such a blessing. I picture one of those kitchens at dusk. The walls are damp, the air thick with steam. A woman stirs a pot, her hands red from the heat. The soup bubbles, releasing the familiar faintly metallic scent. Her daughter sits by the fire, coughing softly. Outside, the city hums with the noise of carts and footsteps. She ladles the soup into a bowl, smiles faintly, and says nothing. The illusion of comfort is all she has left. The empire's appetite for cheap food mirrored its hunger for control. It took everything that was unfit for the table and turned it into profit. The poor became the final consumers of decay, their suffering an accepted cost of progress. The streets filled with the smell of frying meat, and behind it lingered the scent of disease and despair. The story of these meatballs reveals how desperation can turn decay into sustenance. What looked like nourishment was only death shaped by human hands, and as the markets grew louder and richer, another deception waited quietly. A poison so ordinary, so sweet, that even the most cautious would not resist its taste. The story of Victorian junk food was not just about filth, greed, or ignorance. It was about control. In a society that prized obedience and image, Food became another tool for discipline, especially for women. They were told what to eat, how to behave while eating, and even how their appetites reflected their morality. The empire demanded order in every corner of life, and diet was no exception. Women were expected to consume gracefully, to find satisfaction in small, delicate portions, and to suppress any sign of physical desire, even hunger. The poison in their food mirrored the quiet suffocation in their daily lives. Every sweet, every pastry, every meal was both a symbol of refinement and a slow act of submission. It is hauntingly absurd that a society obsessed with control managed to make obedience look elegant. In polite homes, meals were rehearsed rituals, the tablecloths were spotless, the silverware gleamed, and the dishes were served in precise order. Women were praised for their restraint, the way they cut their meat into tiny bites, the way they smiled politely through the taste of bitterness. They learned that to refuse food was rude, but to eat with enthusiasm was unladylike. So they performed moderation, swallowing carefully and never too much. It did not matter if the meal was laced with lead, arsenic, or borax. What mattered was composure. The perfect woman ate like a doll, beautiful, silent, and incapable of protest. Beyond those dining rooms, the message was the same. The working women who bought street food or market sweets were told, in different words, to be grateful. They were taught that cheap food was their blessing, that progress had finally reached even the poorest. They accepted what they were given because refusal meant hunger. Factories sold them meal rations, schools gave their children spoiled porridge, and doctors prescribed chemical tonics for weakness. In every corner of the empire, the women consumed what others dictated. They were taught that pain was a sign of endurance, not a warning. If one compares it to modern times, it would be like praising someone for drinking polluted water as proof of humility. The cruelty lies in how invisible it all was. The empire did not need to silence women by force when their suffering could be disguised as routine. They obeyed because obedience was called virtue, and silence was called grace. The advertisements reinforced the illusion. Posters showed radiant mothers and daughters smiling over canned meats and coloured sweets. Pamphlets declared that chemical foods were the gift of modern science. The message was clear: to question such progress was backward, even ungrateful. Women who doubted industrial food were mocked as hysterical or uneducated. Every household manual praised cleanliness and refinement, while promoting products that poisoned the body. It was not just a market system. It was a moral system, teaching that survival depended on submission. The tragedy was not only physical but also psychological. Generations of women learned to mistrust their senses. They ignored the metallic taste in sugar, the strange smell in milk, and the numbness after a meal. They were told those sensations meant nothing, that beauty and purity were visible, not felt. The empire's factories and food vendors relied on that blindness. A population that cannot trust its own perception is easy to govern. What began with food spread into everything: fashion, medicine, faith, even love. Consumption became obedience, and obedience became identity. The result was a quiet epidemic. Women fainted at dinner parties, collapsed in factories, and died in their homes without knowing why. Their deaths were recorded with polite phrases: exhaustion, feminine weakness, influenza. No one linked them to the bright-coloured sweets, the buttery pastries, the shining bread. Death had become aesthetic, softened by ritual. Funerals were neat, graves adorned with flowers. Even decay had its decorum. It is deeply unsettling how suffering can be transformed into an art form when society demands beauty above truth. The empire's citizens believed they were living at the height of civilization, yet their refinement hid rot beneath every surface. They trusted progress so blindly that even death seemed like a sign of advancement. The poison did not only kill bodies, it shaped minds. It created a culture where compliance was easier than awareness. Reformers did try to fight back. A handful of doctors, journalists, and social activists published reports on food adulteration. They collected samples, conducted experiments, and begged Parliament for laws. But their voices were small against the machinery of profit. Factory owners claimed the reports were exaggerated. Newspapers, owned by advertisers, printed reassurances, and for every reformer who shouted, thousands preferred comfort over confrontation. The change that finally came did not arrive because people woke up. It came because the poison reached the rich. When members of the upper class began to fall ill, the tone shifted. Suddenly, safety became a concern. Laws were proposed, inspections enforced, and ingredients labelled. The same practices that had been ignored for decades were now scandalous. Yet even these reforms carried hypocrisy. The poor continued to eat the same adulterated food for years after, only now without public attention. Cleanliness, once again, belonged to those who could afford it. The legacy of that era lingers. The Victorian junk food crisis was more than a chapter of industrial history. It was a blueprint for how societies disguise exploitation as progress. Every packet of sweetness, every bottle of flavouring, every claim of purity served a deeper function to train people to accept what they were given without question. It was a social experiment written in sugar and poison. The victims were mostly women because women were the easiest to blame. When they grew sick, they were weak. When they doubted, they were hysterical. When they died, they were unfortunate. In truth, they were the most faithful participants in an empire built on illusion. They followed the rules, believed the promises, and paid the price. The empire rewarded their obedience with memorials and silence. The dead did not rise to accuse anyone. They simply disappeared, one meal at a time, into the polite language of progress. I imagine one of those women, perhaps a mother, sitting at her small kitchen table. The window fogs from the steam of boiling tea. Her hands are rough from washing, her dress faded. She breaks a biscuit in half and gives the larger piece to her daughter, smiling faintly. The biscuit crumbles, sweet and crisp, smelling faintly of chemicals. The child eats, unaware. The mother takes her own bite, swallowing the same poison she has fed herself for years. Outside, the street is quiet. The world continues. The illusion remains. By the end of the century, the empire celebrated its greatness. The cities glowed with light. The factories roared with pride. And the women who had endured quietly were remembered not for their pain, but for their grace. Their deaths were absorbed into the narrative of progress. The world learned to call it the golden age of urban life, an era of innovation and cleanliness. Few remembered that behind that glow lay the bones of those who had eaten its lies. The story of Victorian junk food is not merely about contamination, but about conditioning. It shows how a society can teach its people to mistake obedience for virtue and endurance for strength. The empire's greatness was fed by the silence of those who suffered, and its beauty was built on the bodies of those who never complained. Perhaps the greatest poison of all was not in the food, but in the belief that suffering quietly was noble. And so, as the lights of the Victorian streets fade into the past, this story ends as softly as it began, with women eating, smiling, and dying without protest. The empire may be gone, but the lesson remains. Question what is offered to you, even when it glitters, even when it promises sweetness. Not all progress is nourishment. Good night. Listener, may your table be honest, your food pure, and your rest untouched by the poisons of the past. Sleep well beneath the quiet hum of a safer world.